I would also like to highlight that FEPS has been active in publishing on these topics. For example, 1 year ago, we published in English a book by Gesine Schwan, Professor Gesine Schwan, under the title Towards a Humane Refugee Policy for the European Union. This was originally published in German under a slightly different title, but this revised volume, which we launched together with the Egmont Institute, the Foreign Affairs Institute of the Belgian government last year, gives a hint about what we consider to be a progressive policy in this field, and I can wholeheartedly recommend. We also have French language publications like this one in the area of migration studies, with a lot of statistics for those who are interested. So you can either pick up your own hard copy, or you can look at the FEPS website and find these, but also other publications that can be completely downloaded freely without any charge. So this time around, we came together in Brussels. Previously, 1 year ago, we had meetings of the group in other locations, including Addis Abeba, to ensure that we do not only have a Eurocentric perspective, but we have a balanced view shared between European colleagues, but also African colleagues from diverse countries, and what we produce as an output, whether it is recommendations or analytical papers, policy studies, it has a joint perspective. And we have a convergence of our understanding, but also a convergence of our arguments. Let me just highlight that in the discussions so far, it pretty much stood out that migration as an issue cannot be really studied in separation from a broader context of cooperation. And I should even avoid the word development cooperation, because now in the current context, this is also becoming an expression with an echo from the past, and probably in the new era, which is perhaps a transition towards the multipolarity in the world system, a new type of thinking, and also a new vocabulary will be needed to describe the conditions we are in, but also the policies that we would like to see. Finally, I would like to express my gratitude to Anna Terron, who has been the chair of the Progressive Migration Group as a former Minister of Immigration in the Spanish government. She's had an immense experience to share with us, but also guide with insight the preparations for each meeting, but also the implementation. Sadly, my colleague, who is the most responsible and knowledgeable in this field, Hedwig Justo, cannot be here today because of illness, but she's also been hugely instrumental to organize and prepare the meetings. So from this position, I would like to wish her a good recovery in the coming weeks. With this introduction, let's open the serious work of the day with the first panel, which is going to be moderated by Sarah Boyarchuk, who is a research assistant professor in the Center of Migration Research at the University of Warsaw. And just one more point, Sarah, that this session is being recorded. And if you have any kind of objection to recording, you can feel free to signal it to us. Otherwise, I hope that the recording is also going to be to the benefit of everyone else who is interested in this subject, interested in the work of FEPS, but also Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you on the first panel that we're going to talk about the impact of European asylum reform on African countries. And today on the panel, we have 4 speakers. First one is Attilia Manganese. She's the head of special projects in office of the executive director at the Institute for Security Studies. The second speaker is Jerome Tubiana. She's operational advisor at on refugee issues for Doctors Without Borders. Sorry. The third speaker, Alberto Midhat, a senior policy analyst and head of the European Diversity and Migration Program at EPC. And our fourth speaker, which is Juan Fernando Lopez Aguilar, he might join us in a due time as he's running late. So I would like to welcome our speakers. Good morning. Panel will run in the following order. So each of the speakers will be given 5 minutes for the opening statement. Then we will collect a couple of questions from from the audience. We'll do it in, let's say, 2-3 questions altogether. Then we'll give a chance to our speakers to answer before we wrap up, when they'll be also given about 1 minute for the final statement, and then I will conclude our discussion. So, Attilia, would you like to start then?
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be speaking here today. I'll start maybe with a recent quote. "We are strengthening our internal security through concrete action, and we're continuing our tough stance against irregular migration." This comes just yesterday when Germany officially announced additional temporary controls on land borders that will start in 6 days. This extends existing controls on land borders towards the east of Germany, with further land borders both in the north, west, and south of Germany. In many ways, one would say, but what does this really have to do with the conversation we're having on the impact of EU asylum reform? These measures come, in essence, as a result of a call, both internally within Germany, within the German government, but also given, at least for the German authorities, an increased threat perhaps that the far right could gain greater control simply because their stance on migration, on asylum seeker processes is much tougher and is gaining traction, popular traction, if the election results, regional election results in Thuringia are anything to go by. That being said, almost as an immediate response, Austria's foreign minister said that his country would not take in any refugees or immigrants turned away by Germany at the border. I am not from the European Union. I'm not from a Schengen country. So I will ask this to those of you that are, in a rhetorical sense, so please don't answer right now. If the actions now, as we're seeing unfolding, which are essentially as a result of the vilification of one, if these are actions that will then, in many ways, result in future to a reconfiguration of what we know as a free movement zone within the Schengen. Importantly, and maybe let me phrase it a different way, if the actions of one German resulted in the vilification of all Germans and Europeans, what would that look like? So I said, I'm not European, I'm African. And what we have seen in terms of the current development of EU asylum reform, if reform is the word I would use for it, is how systemic administrative failures in part have gotten us to a situation where the actions of some Africans result in the vilification of all. It results in measures that effectively make it harder for people to be able to move, but it doesn't address the reasons why people are taking risky journeys to do so. So what it effectively does is it simply means people still make those journeys, but they make them in far more precarious, far more dangerous ways. an effort to over-control actually puts things out of control. And this is in Europe. But again, I'm not European. So as I wrap up my initial 5 minutes here, I want to take us maybe to the African continent, because a lot of the narrative around the ways in which the EU asylum process has to be reformed centers on this idea that there is a mass movement out of Africa into Europe, both irregularly and regularly, but a conflation of the asylum seeker process with, of course, the immigration regulation process, such that for most Africans, the distinction doesn't really exist. And yet Africa continues to host more refugees than Europe could ever be able to host. Africa does this with far less money. Countries like Uganda and Ethiopia that you often hear on the news as effectively being countries struggling themselves have been forced in many ways to adopt more progressive refugee response frameworks, simply because if they were to adopt the restrictive refugee response frameworks that we see elsewhere in the world, it would be catastrophic. It has meant that for a country like Ethiopia, that itself is facing regional conflicts within its own territory, it has had to adopt inclusive approaches to dealing with refugees out of Somalia, both Sudan's South Sudan and Sudan Khartoum, but also how to manage the way in which it deals with its own internally displaced population. Ethiopia is no Germany. You can do a little bit of research on your own around that. And yet they have had to deal with these challenging issues, again, limited resources, insufficient infrastructure, and a lack of institutional backing. Today, as the Progressive Migration Group, we are a couple of people short because one of them, an Ethiopian passport holder, did not get their visa because just 4 months ago, there was a decision of the European Council that effectively restricted the issuance of multiple entry visas to Ethiopian nationals, not on the actions of all Ethiopian nationals, but because the Ethiopian government refused to enter into an agreement on returns. I would argue that the person who's not here today was not involved in those negotiations, and yet I'm here and he is not. I don't come from Ethiopia, if you are wondering. So to restate what the impact of the EU asylum reform on Africa, and I say Africa, not African countries, because I also want to focus on African people as well. It is to say, while it might appear as a distant policy, at least on the African continent, it is very much real in how people are able, if they want to, access the European continent, even if it is for a progressive migration conference and not to come and stay here. That the EU's approach towards Africa really doesn't take into account the very real situation on the continent and why it is that people are taking these detrimental journeys. In fact, it is going to create more challenges and in many ways have a direct impact back at home that can then be easily politicized. As I end, I only have a minute to go. Niger, which was the bastion, if I can put it that way, within the Sahel region for the European Union in terms of migration management, underwent an unconstitutional change of government by way of a coup in July of last year. The first legal instruments that the military junta sought to overturn were legal instruments related to migration management. In fact, the very first instrument actually focused on trafficking and smuggling in persons, which they had worked hard to criminalize before they even went to procedures on asylum. Now, I started with a bit of a question, so I'll end with another one. If a country that had been co-opted into Europe's externalization of its security and borders decides, whether through a military junta, that one of the key aspects that will gain it continued popular support is to undo legal instruments that effectively protect Africans against trafficking, against smuggling of persons, because people are also seeing it as an externalization of Europe's control, What happens if all 55 do the same? I'm done.
Thank you very much. I hope you have noted questions already. We'll give a chance to our second speaker, Jerome.
Thank you. And I will show you a little slideshow because I want to show you some graphs and figures, and that's also why I need to look at my laptop from time to time just to remember numbers. Well, thanks for inviting us, MSF. My presentation is based on a draft research report that we hope to publish soon, relying on our field observations on projects in Libya, in Tunisia, in Chad and Sudan, as well as in Calais in France. So it's about those policies commonly known as externalization policies, which the EU calls the external dimension of asylum and immigration. And they have, in fact, two dimensions. The first aims at externalizing asylum procedures. And the second, I will focus on the second, aims at blocking migrants as far upstream as possible by providing financial support to countries of origin or transit. So we have witnessed the effects of those policies in the projects I mentioned, in the MSF projects I mentioned over the years. We sometimes feeling we miss legitimacy to, as a medical organization, to discuss the impact of EU policies. We based ourselves a lot on our medical data and focused on the indirect consequences on measures hampering movements on the health and the mental health of our migrant patients. But what we noticed is that the EU did not seem bothered by such consequences, telling at best that they were the responsibilities of non-EU partners, or at worst of the migrants themselves. So we began then to enlarge the scope, trying to figure all those effects of those policies, questioning first the realities of the EU's claims that the flows were either decreasing or increasing, depending on the place and policy. And we also questioned EU's claims that their policies had positive effects in terms of decreasing migrants' deaths or saving lives, if you want, an issue on which MSF's Epidemiological Research Center has a good expertise. And then we looked as well at important effects on fragile countries with histories of authoritarian rules and armed conflict, effects on human rights, on rule of law, on peace, security, stability, and state building. So that's a lot. I'll try to summarize. In the aim of curbing migrant flows to Europe, so as you know, the European Union has increasingly committed to those externalization policies, and in particular, through partnership with authorities in countries of origin or transit. It's not new. Such policies date back at least to the famous or infamous 2008 friendship deal between Italy, Berlusconi's at the time, and Gaddafi in Libya. And then there were similar agreements which actually multiplied more recently, notably since the so-called migrant crisis that was already mentioned in 2015, when 1 million mostly Syrian refugees arrived in Europe, leading the EU to strike a deal with Turkey. You can get the second slide. Yeah, that's a more generic map. So let's look at last year's figures, mostly on arrivals to Europe. So you have them on the map, the big flows. If you discuss, the EU appears satisfied with the results of its externalization policies and repeats us that it intends to continue engaging with old and new external partners. And the main justification for this is that those policies, which are systematically evaluated in terms of migrant arrivals in Europe, are considered to have successfully reduced some flows. And indeed, if you look at two relatively old partnerships with Libya and Niger, which Otilia mentioned, as well as you also need to take into account the very organized reduction and blockages of European sea rescue efforts in the central Mediterranean, had an immediate impact on arrivals from Libya in Europe. So dropping from their peak, the peak was 165,000 arrivals from Libya to Italy in 2016 to 7,000 in 2019. That's a huge decrease indeed. Since then, arrivals from Libya gradually increased again, but remained limited, 52,000 in 2023. However, that year, as you see on the map, 157,000 migrants arrived in Italy, a figure nearing the 2016 peak, explained by the shift of departures from Libya to Tunisia. And that we'll mention again. It is an illustration of the frequently observed dynamic that blockades on some routes lead to the opening or reopening of others, such as recently the particularly risky Atlantic crossing to the Canary Islands, probably the most deadly migration route in the world currently, and that you can see on the map too, the increasing flows on that route. In the meantime, global or local rising flows and changes in routes have been yet another justification for the EU to continue its externalization policies unabated, and in particular complete its blockade of North Africa. If we can have the next slide, please. Thank you. Sorry, maybe this table is a little bit small and complicated, but the main focus should be the blue columns of sea crossings from Libya to Italy. So what we see also is that focusing on numbers and flows, the EU has overshadowed other effects and side effects of old and recent externalization policies south of the Mediterranean. So we have a likely underestimated 25,000 deaths counted in the last decade in the whole Mediterranean. Of them, over 20,000 took place in the central Mediterranean of Libya. And more crucially, what you see on that graph as well, it's while the rate of interceptions by the Libyan Coast Guard sharply rose at the same time that the flows decreased, it rose from 12 to 50% in the crucial years between 2017 and 2019. But in the meantime, and contrary to what the EU says, the death rate at sea did not decrease. It actually rose at the same period from 2 to 70%, which is quite big. It's a lot of deaths which could have been easily avoided without those policies. And it's definitely contradicting the EU claim that its policies are saving lives. Concretely, what happened in Libya is that the partnership established since 2017 with then Libya's internationally recognized government in Tripoli has remained very precarious simply because the country has no unified state institutions and forces yet. Since more than 7 years, you can't find a proper representative of the Libyan Coast Guard, for instance. Meanwhile, the acknowledged lack of safety for migrants in Libya is making illegal sea crossings the almost unique way out of the country. As you can see with those blue columns, they're always far above the small red column on the graph, meaning resettlement, in the context where legal and safe pathways, despite being praised by the European Union and member states, are increasingly limited. And I know the next panel will discuss this in more detail. If we can look at the next slide. Okay, I will do my best. I still have 3 slides, but okay, maybe we can. So on the next slide, you can see the shift of the departures from Libya to Tunisia in 2023, which illustrates extremely quick European reactions to new flows. Last year, the EU concluded an agreement with Tunisia amid massive violence against sub-Saharan migrants, which actually pushed more of them to take the sea. And the EU Commission oddly labeled that deal a blueprint and signed a similar one with Egypt, while in fact those agreements are rather copies of past partnerships, some described as models as well, but whose results were no less questionable. Next slide, please. Sorry, I'm trying to rush a bit. You can see, talking of past cooperations further south in Sudan, and you can see on that map the current flows to Sudan, from Sudan, sorry, to Europe. We had a 10-year-old partnership that has been criticized for its damaging side effect of contributing to legitimize the former military Islamist regime in Sudan. And in yet another illustration of the counterproductivity of Europe's migration policies, what we have today is that the regular and paramilitary forces, which were supposed to act as Europe's border guards, are now fighting each other, causing what has been labeled the world's worst displacement crisis. 10 million displaced since 1 year. Nevertheless, the EU failed to build a coordinated protection response for Sudanese refugees, like it had done successfully for Ukrainians. Next slide, please. Trying to rush. And let me end with the example of Niger, which Otilia already mentioned. There also, the EU's claim that its policies saved lives is inaccurate. In fact, as you can see on that graph, migrants' deaths multiplied by 5 between 2016 and 2017, precisely when an EU-inspired law criminalizing the transport of migrants was enforced. And those widely unpopular in Niger migration policies, agreed between the EU and an elected government, for once, are believed to have contributed to the military coup Otilia mentioned, with the new authorities immediately repealing the partnership last year. And the EU's immediate regret of that change show Europe has yet to pay attention to the damage made by its migration policies south of the Mediterranean, systematically focusing on flows while overlooking crucially humanitarian, political, and security consequences. And that will be my last slide. So as MSF, we have recommendations, and I hope we'll still have a bit of time later to discuss them. Our main recommendations on the matter are very similar to some of the progressive groups' recommendation. I may mention a few of them later on, and thank you for your attention. Sorry for rushing.
Thank you very much. And now it's time for Alberto, our third speaker.
Thank you. Thank you to the organizers for the future impact of the reforms, particularly on human rights. One, perhaps unnecessarily optimistic, and another one perhaps overly optimistic. And it's useful to keep in mind when you take a look at the texts of the reforms, and I'm not inviting you to do that in your free time, that there are both positive and less positive elements that will also contribute to shaping future. To this effect would have to be entered into in compliance with the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, which means also involving the Parliament. What does it mean in practice? Many of the informal agreements that have just been mentioned, but even the EU-Turkey statement wouldn't fall under the scope of this notion. Let me give you another example. Financial contributions that can be used for actions in third countries that are to be considered an alternative to relocations. This, by the way, formalizes the link between internal and external dimensions of migration policy to the extent that there was none before. These have also attracted a lot of scrutiny and criticism. However, under the Asylum and Migration Management Regulation, these contributions would have to be used in full compliance with human rights. So given all of these, I think that the question is not really who is right between the optimist and the pessimist. Possibly they might be both right, but rather the question is, how do you use these in order to build a future where everybody is better off, the people on the move, the countries of origin, as well as the receiving societies. And I'm going to use a bit of a provocative question to start delving a little bit into this issue, because I don't think that there will be many fans of the new pact in this room. I apologize, but I'm giving you a bit of a spoiler there. And it seems to me that the problem might not be that there is now a pact between member states. The problem might be that there is no pact between member states or the European Union and the African countries or third countries more broadly. And so in this respect, let me zoom in on 3 specific issues which are quite important in this respect. First, the absence or weakening of governance structures at the international level. The second one, the lack of consensus behind objectives pursued in partnerships. And perhaps this afternoon or in the later session, we'll also hear more about this. And the third one, funding and how funding should be used. I know I have limited time, so I will limit myself to some broad stroke observations. And when it comes to structures, the new pact actually introduces a very complex and bureaucratic but sophisticated machinery with clear responsibilities for institutional actors and for agencies and even international organizations. It redefines the role of the Council, the Commission, and the Parliament. It also introduces regulatory committees, committees with operational responsibilities and technical responsibilities. And when you consider these, it is obvious that there is no functional equivalent when we talk about relationship with third countries. And if you consider the latest developments when it comes to third country cooperation, and some of these has already been mentioned, what we can observe is a lack of commitment to the objectives of the global compacts with some member states who are yet to sign into it. We see high-level political forums which are very, very sporadic and with very narrowly defined mandates. We also, and this is probably going to get worse in the future, we see very starkly conflicting visions among donor countries to international organizations like IOM that could sustain a more balanced approach. And I think that the risk is that we will only see this widening in the future. Let me spend 1 minute on the other 2 issues, the lack of shared objectives and conflicting visions around funding in particular. Probably Juan Fernando later we will say a bit about this, but you probably know that national authorities are now developing implementation plans to infuse life, so to say, in the newly reformed rules. It is very obvious that many lack the infrastructure and the trained personnel to implement their responsibilities. And in this context, my informed guess is that many of them will demand strong financial support other than operational support by the institutions. And we are looking into a future where there will have to be trade-offs when it comes to the budget. Everybody wants a bit of budget for themselves. Will there be enough money for both support member states' implementation of the new rules and a partnership with African countries which is balanced? I'm a bit skeptical about this. The last point, and then I come to a conclusion, going back to some of the key observations that you made when it comes to third countries cooperation. The rules only enter into force in 2 years' time, and there is serious uncertainty around their impact on the ground for the reasons that I briefly explained. In this context, I think that the appetite by member states to limit irregular arrivals and increase returns will not decrease, but more likely it will increase. And we've seen this also in the strategic agenda of the Council and in the political guidelines of the Commission. We will know more about the portfolio of the new Home Commissioners this week, probably. And I, again, guess that this will only reinforce this trend. So where do we go from here? I think there are possibilities to expand this. Lots of it depends on those shared objectives. And I think maybe this panel will not provide a very optimistic view, perhaps the next panel more so, but we also need a narrative. And I conclude with this because yesterday afternoon, we spent a bit of time talking about narratives. It is obvious that there are very differing views between the way in which migration is perceived in African countries, in countries of origin and transit, and the way in which it is perceived in Europe. And I think, I am sorry to say, and with this I will conclude, both the progressives and the mainstream conservatives are losing the battles of the narratives. And perhaps we'll talk more about this later. I will leave it to this.
Good day to you all, and thank you, FEPS, Foundation for European Progressive Studies, for bringing us together, for giving me the chance to address you, trying to present before you a summarized version of all of the dimensions that bring me here. First of all, member of the European Parliament. So, member of a majority within the European Parliament which takes seriously the institutional nature of the European Parliament as a lawmaking body. We do make laws in the European Parliament, and there's not a single chance in which I do not highlight the very importance of this principle. The European Parliament is not a arguing forum. It's a lawmaking body. We must make laws and deliver by making laws in the European Parliament. That's one thing. Second, when related to migration or asylum, it becomes the hardest issue you might think of, because migration and asylum have long been the sole competence of national member states. But they ceased to be at a certain point of time, particularly when the Lisbon Treaty entered into force with the Charter. So with a clear mandate of setting forth and putting in place a European legal migration system and a European legal migration system, common system. That means by lawmaking, putting laws in place. And surely it's been taken for granted, surely in every floor that has been taken so far, that migration and asylum happen to be the most divisive and challenging issues ever in the European agenda. Not only because they were long the competence of national member states, and some of them are rooted in the inertia that they keep holding control of an issue that actually escapes from the capacity to respond individually, and it takes a European legal scale of response. And second, because it happens to be not only reluctant as a lawmaking issue, but also because it's most divisive ideologically, geographically, and politically. Take a look at member states. Most of them do argue very strongly about the approach, and they resist the European legal frame, which is precisely meant to encompass them all and being binding, putting in place legal obligations. My second dimension here is I'm a socialist. I'm a progressive. So my aim as a lawmaker in this field, by putting in place the Migration and Asylum Pact and the Migration and Asylum system, has been always meant to enhance fundamental rights considerations, protecting fundamental rights, human rights, consistency with international humanitarian law, and of course, taking into account the particularly vulnerable situations, meaning naturally minors, unaccompanied minors, women, violence and trafficking, making an incredible difference when it comes to women in the migratory routes, including, of course, when it comes to asylum seeking. So believe me, we have done our very best to give those values a chance through the most challenging lawmaking process you might think of, and the European Parliament have as ever managed. Precisely the one meant to put in place the Migration and Asylum Pact. Just naturally, take it for granted. In the outcome, in the result, after 2 mandates in a row, 2 full legislatures dealing with this issue, the outcome could not be satisfactory for any of us, and of course not for me. So I take all the criticism for granted. And yet, we had to. Because not delivering at all, not putting in place anything at all, ending up 2 mandates in a row, arguing so strongly with no result whatsoever, that is actually some kind of a statement. We fail, we're incapable, we cannot be to the height of this challenge. We will never make it. And that is not an issue. That is not a point. That is not a choice. That's not an acceptable political choice, not for me as a progressive. So despite all the differences, despite all the difficulties, despite all the contradictions, we had to put in place some laws, meaning that is better than having nothing at all. The third point is that I'm a Spanish socialist. Actually, I'm a Canarian. I was born in the Canaries. I live there. I've been the Secretary General of the Canarian Socialist Party for years. So I take very seriously Africa. More than ever before, Africa is closer to the Canary Islands, more than ever before. They have always been 90 kilometers far from the African continent, but in the globalization, that means nothing. 90 kilometers is nothing. So the Canary Islands have never been so close, has never been closer to the African continent, and to what Africa actually means as we speak now. Africa is in a demographic revolution. It's doubling its population as we speak. Doubling its population. When the European Union is aging, we're all 60. We're all 60 in the European Union or more. In the African continent, they're all 20. They are all 20. And drought, tyranny, warfare, lack of opportunity, lack of hope are expelling millions from the African in all directions, including the European Union. Do we have to panic? No, the answer is not. But that is not an issue that can be somehow sorted out and reduced to zero. It's not going to happen. That is not an option. This is a kind of issue that is not going to wither away. It's not going to disappear. It's an issue that we have to handle. When you have a structural challenge, you cannot simply have an aspiration of overcoming it. No, you have to handle it. You have to handle the vicinity of Africa. So it means a lot of countries of transit and origin at a European scale. Of course, as we have seen so far, mostly it has been individual bilateral moves by national governments in Africa. That means particularly when pressed by some panicking situation, by some overwhelming pressure, migratory pressure from a certain African point, then a prime minister travels at times accompanied by some European big shot to some African country and offers some millions. Please stop it. Please help me to stop that from going any further. Please reduce it. Please cooperate. Just understandably so. It happens. It's happening now as we speak. Prime ministers keep traveling in Africa. Just recently, a Spanish socialist prime minister made an African tour to Mauritania, Gambia, and Senegal. With that kind of a message, please cooperate. We're offering you some millions, but please cooperate. We have to stop this. Okay, that's understandable, but it cannot last forever. We have to go European scale and have a strategy towards countries of transit and origin, helping Africa effectively to change this dynamic. Then, as to the Migration and Asylum Pact, I'm sure you know that was a long story, and to make it short, is a combination of regulations. That is a progress in itself. Regulations is binding law for member states. It doesn't need transposition. They are not directives. It doesn't need internal legislation. It simply creates obligations for all the member states altogether, and also creates rights that can be protected before the judicial systems of the member states all the way to the European Court of Justice, including the Charter of the European Union, which protects foreigners when applied EU law. Under EU law, they are also protected. Foreigners, that means migrants and asylum seekers as well. Then, second point, all of the regulations have human rights and fundamental rights and vulnerable people considerations, very especially. But we also take very seriously, including, of course, the crisis regulation, of which I was the rapporteur throughout all of these years. But it also takes into consideration the so-called external dimension of the European Migration and Asylum Pact, which means a lot of transits of transit and origin. And in that regard, there are a number of pieces of legislation, including the resettlement framework, which is also a regulation, including the, yes, I'm finishing. The last statement I wanted to talk you off is precisely the point related to financial contributions meant to third countries, Those financial contributions, which is a form of solidarity, which has not existed so far. So as much as you may criticize the limits or the shortcomings of every piece of this puzzle, take them all together so they can make better sense. And in that regard, the solidarity message related to financial contributions, according to the Asylum and Migration Fund of the European Union, the so-called AMIF, should be aimed to enhancing the capacity of asylum and migration in third countries, promoting legal migration, well-managed mobility, strengthening bilateral and regional partnerships before the countries of transit and origin and the European Union. Assisted voluntary returns, which have to be dignified and consistent with the fundamental rights involved, with the human rights involved. Returns, it's an obsession of ministers of interior, understandably so. I relate to them regularly because I've been representing the Committee of Liberty, Justice and Home Affairs in the Council of Ministers of Interior as well as in Justice for years. And believe me, the ministers of Interior are obsessed with returning irregular migrants, obsessed. But it's pathetic. The outcome is absolutely, by now, absolutely non-significant. A small percentage of people which are meant to be, which are disqualified as irregular cannot be returned because there are no agreements, there is no legal architecture, there's no cooperation with countries of origin ready to accept them, dignified returns and voluntary returns. We have to also take that into consideration, going better in that direction. And of course, fighting migrants, smuggling and human trafficking a lot by combined forces and strategically so. Supporting effective human rights-based migration and asylum policy. So taking human rights seriously and fundamental rights seriously involved. Thank you.
We'll now take, let's say, 3-4 questions, and then we'll turn back to our speakers. We have about half an hour for the discussion, so I think we have quite okay time. Are there any pressing issues, any questions that you would like to ask? Don't worry, I have some questions, but.
Hi, should I stand up? Yes, probably. Well, thank you so much for the input. It was really great, quite broad. But I had a few thoughts and I would like to get your input on that. I'm working for the city of Berlin and I've been discussing especially the pact since a while now with other European cities, looking for the impact on the ground, like on the more administrative level. And I really enjoyed it might be a bit, I really enjoyed the sentence systematic administrative failure that was mentioned by the first speaker, because after that, when we explained the pact as a complex bureaucratic mechanism, the pathetic outcome of return policies, etc., I don't really see that the pact can fight the systematic failure that we see right now, and that what we see in Germany is basically a response to the systematic failure. So I would like to know your thought of how the current situation where we see administrative bodies in Europe extremely overwhelmed by implementing the current regime and with a new complex bureaucratic mechanism that is the pact. And I've studied a bit the law, and I would, even if I wouldn't recommend, it shows, if you look at it, how complex it is, how does how does over controlling like wish we have in the European Union can be implemented. And the second question is, if we look at that and let's say we go down this negative perception of the implementation is due to lack of resources, lack of first personnel and fund, not going where we would like to see it, or the ones that created would like to see it. What does it mean? What is the impact on the other side? Because what we were estimating as cities, what we can see already in other parts is that simply people would avoid the asylum system, people would avoid the official structure, people would take into account to be undocumented because there's still enough ways to earn a bit of living, to survive in the communities, especially in cities. And that again has a huge impact on society as a whole, because it means risk in health, in security, in education, etc., etc. If you're not undocumented, you have no access to all these services. So these are like my both kind of interrelated questions, this kind of idea of over-regulation and the pact, what it plays in that role, and then the consequences if this regulation can't be implemented, what does it mean for people who will still be coming here? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think we have another question over there.
Hi, first of all, thank you to the panel. I have a question about the pact from my personal point of view. It's kind of a miracle it even exists, despite all its flaws, because it followed so many years of deadlock. So I'm wondering, what are the lessons that we could take from that? Like, was it a particular political moment, or what are the lessons we can learn for future negotiations, like even just within Europe? Because if we need more fine-tuning, we need to be able to talk to each other and not have this immobilizing gridlock that we've been facing for so long.
Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Ahmed, and I have also the background of immigration. I come from Afghanistan, so the country maybe in the today's more discussion. Let me first of all thank you for your great topics what you have discussed. It's interesting, but let me tell you, today's world more than before interrelated. It means that we have morally and emotionally interrelated with each other. I want to just ask a questions. Maybe all the people can, the guys who are there, they can respond. That my idea is that migration and people who come from other countries, let's see them as an opportunity rather than as a threat. Today, let me tell you, there are more people from many countries come to everywhere. Like, I'm not talking about a specific country, but this is a big opportunity. And especially Europe is a country, a region. Before was a region for cooperations and for help. This is a big name even in my country. So a very bad conception what I have. Let me share you. I'm coming from Afghanistan, so with a very good program from the government of Germany, and I thank them for this opportunity to give me that I come. But right now, I am when I am introduce myself with many peoples in the country, in the Germany, with some people reacting as a negative. This means that they see all this as a problems. Let me tell you, there is a problem in introduction, maybe, or maybe in the process of integration. So how this happen? I will ask you, and I will invite your attentions in policy making, how to help this process as a good opportunity, not as a threat. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do you want to answer the questions or shall we collect some more? All right.
Thank you very much indeed for a very enriching panel. My name is Wolfgang Pape, formerly in the Commission. I'm working now on global issues. And I wonder, since we have more numbers of migrants, movements of people in Asia than in Europe and Africa, are there any comparative studies, cooperation, or any way to learn from each other? Are there changes of information, whatever? Because it's not only a matter of quantity, of course. There are qualitative differences, but nevertheless, we could learn from each other, maybe. Thank you.
The other way around, in the other way around, okay? Some comments, okay.
All right.
Yeah, just a reaction. I mean, first, thank you for the points. Thank you for the concerns, and thank you for the values which lie behind, because those are ours, progressive values. The first challenge is to change, we usually say the narrative. Now it has a tendency to be somehow underestimated, the narrative, but the thing is that it really matters. The way we see, the way we approach, and the way we talk about things. You have made it, Hamed, the point. When you talk about migration and integration and social inclusion, it usually steers up a European across a negative reaction. The negative approach is predominant. Negative approach has the upper hand for much too long, and we have to put up a fight. We have to put up a fight in order to change that attitude. Migration is not a threat, nor to our identity, nor to our security. Migration, yes, it's not only an opportunity, it should be a must for an aging society as the European Union, which is declining in every possible way. When we got started in the European Union globally, when it started out, we used to be some 15% of the global population and some 20% of the global GDP. Now we are 6% of global population, 5% of GDP. We're declining. It's obviously we're declining. So we need to change the attitude. The lessons learned from the negotiating process, the lessons learned have to do also with this. We have seen many difficulties related to the predominant negative approach, which is well installed in most of the national governments in member states. And we progressives, we do have to put up a fight about it. We have to somehow ease the negative attitude and, of course, combat the panicking attitude, which tends to depict migrants and asylum seekers as a threat. Criminal offenders, potentially sexual aggressors. That kind of rhetoric is extremely well established in the social nets, and we have to put up a fight when it comes to values. And a final point I will make: lessons when we relate globally to third partners. Whenever you enlarge your view, your vision, your understanding of the fact, the thing is that reality has nothing to do with perceptions. There is no field of action, lawmaking or decision-making in the European Union in which the contradiction between self-interest and your perceived interest is higher than in this regard. Just an example. I come from the Canaries. In the Canaries, it's well established the view that we are having so much migratory pressure coming from Africa because Africa is conspiring against the European Union through the Canaries. That is the well-established approach. They're conspiring against us. They are on the move against us. They're putting pressure on us. They are somehow blackmailing us. The Moroccan king is blackmailing us. They want money in exchange to stop that pressure from happening. But when you travel Morocco, you see that in Morocco, they have an incredible migratory pressure. In Mauritania, they have an incredible migratory pressure. Within Mauritania, there are asylum camps with 100,000, which you don't see in Europe. Nowhere you see in Europe an asylum camp with 100,000 asylum seekers. You see that in Mali. And of course, you see that in African countries. In every African country, they have an incredible migratory pressure, but we ignore that. We tend to think that they are doing their best to put pressure on us, where actually they are trying to change things from within too, and they need to be assisted, and we need to cooperate in order to understand each other and work together better in order to deal with an issue which is not to wither away. It's not disappearing. We have to handle those challenges, understanding the very facts and overcoming the contradiction between facts and perceptions. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief so everybody has an opportunity to come in, but very good questions, and I'll try to address them in order. The first one on the systematic failures, which I also found to be a very good observation. I think it's worth asking ourselves, why do we have regulations that are so comprehensive and detailed? And the answer is because there was a systematic failure to comply with the previous set of rules. And because of lack of political trust between member states, what we have as a result is a very comprehensive set of rules which are binding and will have implications for all levels of government, including local authorities, while these stakeholders were not systematically involved in the legislation process. And so this is something also to be considered for future reference. Now, is this all bad? Perhaps the fact that now national authorities are drafting implementation plan is an opportunity to stock take about the resources that exist at the national and local level, and more objectively determine whether there is a risk of more systemic failures in the future. Now, I would be curious to continue after with a coffee to learn if you were consulted as City of Berlin in the drafting of the national plan by the German government. I was given interesting answers to this question by local authorities in other member states, but we can continue later on this. Second point, on more broadly speaking, lesson learned for possible further reforms in the future. I think this is a very important question, and it's a question that not only migration specialists are asking themselves, but also experts in other policy areas, because the kind of pressure that the parliament was under to introduce this legislation is not limited to migration reforms. And so there is a risk in the future that because of the, let's say, asymmetric capacity of the institutions and negotiators to conduct the negotiations, we again have similar dynamics in the future. Now, I'm going to give you a take on this, which is both positive and negative. I don't think there will be a new pact again for many, many years. There will not be another attempt to so systematically reform the common asylum system for a good number of years. There will be a new pact eventually, a new pact, but it's not going to be as comprehensive as this. Why also is there not going to be a new pact? And this is a little bit where I kind of disagree with the take on the regulations, particularly taking as example the crisis regulation, because there are exceptions carved out in the regulations for member states to introduce unilaterally further measures that can have serious impact on migration dynamics or even on access to asylum. Maybe something else to be discussed later, how should the EU respond to legislation introduced in Finland? that reduces access to asylum at the border in cases of alleged instrumentalization of migrants. That is going to be a very, very important question into the future. Think about Schengen and how Germany reacted. Allegedly, what the government in Germany decided is in compliance with the reformed Schengen acquis. So again, I don't think that we will have sweeping reforms in the future. Last point, allow me to just cite a very progressive newspaper. The Guardian recently published an article asking, are we getting the migration debate all wrong? And taking a very European perspective, the article asked if the attractiveness of Europe is not a competitive advantage in a context where there is greater competition between high income and even mid-income countries to attract workers. And I think that's a very, very good point. However, I do wonder whether there is not a risk here that there will be two kinds of racism in the future. One racism where we push back against all foreign nationals, and one kind of racism where we only select those who can make a contribution to our labor markets. And that's a complicated issue, but one that I think progressive forces shouldn't shy away from.
Maybe.
We were asked to respond in reverse order, but thank you, Jérôme. Right. So to ensure gender balance in this panel, I'm going to speak for an extra minute.
Even two, I would say.
No, but seriously, I'll try to be quite brief. So where do I start in terms of responding? When the, and I say this with great respect to members of the European Parliament, when the discussions around the formulation of a new pact were underway, and then eventually when the final new pact was adopted, I sarcastically referred to it as a new pact with old ink. Because, and you probably, Alberto, you alluded to it, which is, this is in many ways, it's an internal pact, right? It's a European Union focused agreement, and that is fair. The challenge is that the provisions, so to speak, relate to, and it's a question you posed also, whether how to address this even from the Asian perspective or even going broader, which is for it to be a pact in full implementation, there have to be sub-pacts. There have to be other agreements, other approaches in respect of third continents or countries. And that is where my point of departure came from, which is to effectively say, yes, you can have what is effectively an internal European agreement. That is fair, in the same way that you have other ranges of legal instruments. But if it's an instrument that has external application or that requires policy adjustments even from other countries, then there are tougher conversations that need to be had around its full implementation. When we talk about the joint Africa-Europe strategic approach or partnership, this is a partnership in respect of Africa, quite frankly. I have never heard in a discussion on migration, listening on how Africa deals with refugee flows. It is effectively a partnership that looks at this relationship from a very vertical point of departure. That means there is no space to listen and learn from the challenges that other regions face, be it Africa, be it Asia. How does a region, for example, like Southeast Asia, whose population is almost triple that of Europe, one sub-region, how does it deal with the extent of managing populations? It might not meet all the possible checklists that you would need, but they have to deal with that large number of people, and they have to deal with it in otherwise very difficult circumstances. So some of these conversations do have to be, at the very minimum, trilateral. I say trilateral because, of course, these are the continents that actually are connected. The Americas can also be part of that conversation, but really a lot of what we see, and I speak from the African perspective, which is policies and practices that have a heavier negative, if I could put it that way, impact on the African continent, that were effectively adopted not primarily because as a result of an influx from Africa at the time. When we talk of what you phrased as the migration crisis of 2014, 2015, those were not African migrants or forcibly displaced people from Africa that led to that crisis, so to speak. And yet the fallback, the blowback has been to the immediate neighbor to the south. When we talk of administrative challenges, I'll take us away again from Europe to Africa. I come from Zimbabwe and South Africa. I also have heritage from Portugal for my sins. I would not exist but for migration. When we look at some of the administrative challenges that South Africa faces in its documentation efforts, that has resulted in 3 special dispensations for Lesotho, Zimbabwe, and Angola at different points in time, that have been as a result of an inability to process the numbers of people at certain points in time as quickly as possible. But when we look at how that has blown back on South Africa in different ways, there are points that can be learned there. Again, the EU-AU relationship talks about the relationship in this way, but it doesn't discuss what lessons can be learned even from South Africa, however challenging that may be. The South African election, one of the key issues, contentious as it was, that parties latched onto was migration. What kind of discussions have been had between other European countries and South Africa on this issue? I will tell you that it's been very minimal. But the challenges are the same. It is effectively, when you talk about documentation, the word itself tells you documentation is very much an administrative function. If you are unable to deal with the process of documentation based on your current figures, the answer often is around how do you upskill or how do you expand departments that deal with it. In most of the countries where people move to urban centers because urban centers are far easier for people to even attempt integration. I can only imagine a Zimbabwean migrant trying to settle in Turingia right now. It's not going to happen, right? The likelihood that that person moving into Belgium, for example, is going to come to Brussels is far higher. That means that cities have to be more prepared in terms of how do you deal with these questions administratively, but also in respect of integration, and they have to be funded to be able to do that. I will now go to my penultimate point, which relates to service provision. One of the main challenges that are faced with communities that refer to themselves as host communities, even if they're not welcoming, is the issue around how do we still get the same access to services and service delivery that we had before an influx of people. But often the sentiments that are expressed are a displacement onto the point of weakest resistance. Regardless of whether it is on the basis of nationality, ethnicity, or otherwise, the point of weakest resistance is easiest. Because if we can get rid of these people, then we have enough for ourselves. But we've seen, unfortunately, that that's not the solution. And in fact, it is around how do you ensure equal distribution in a way that actually works. Which brings me to your point, Ahmed, you spoke about effectively around us being a global village, if I can call it that way. One of the things that we didn't talk about, because sometimes when we talk about migration, we can get so bogged on everything that we've talked about. We haven't talked about what a interesting and fascinating place Brussels would be if there was no influence on food, on culture, on music, on innovation from anywhere else other than the Brussels capital region. We have not talked about the many ways in which we ought to be leveraging the benefits while recognizing the risks. Don't ever get me wrong. There are risks inherent in people moving, because the risks aren't in the movement. The risks are in people. People commit crime regardless of their nationality. But the efforts to ensure that actually those benefits can be leveraged better, we need to be investing a lot more time in that, while I'm taking an extra 30 seconds share in investing a lot more time in having gender equality on panels. But the last point I wanted to make is, you said the pact is a miracle. Now, for my sins, I am a lawyer to a fault. A pact being a miracle because it took so long doesn't necessarily mean it serves the intent and purpose that it's supposed to have, because we've had other miracle pacts in the past unrelated to migration, and we need to be courageous enough to say, if the letter of the pact does not actually fulfill what we say are fundamental principles that should guide it, human rights, inclusion, good governance, even democracy within that framework, then it should and can still be amended. Quite frankly, I don't care how much members of European Parliament fight, unless they fight to ensure that the instruments that come out of the EU reflect what they say and what they tell us are EU principles. If they don't, then we have an issue around whether or not there is consistency in the way in which policies are implemented and adopted, and whether or not you have the right to push us on certain standards that are not being met in your own legal instruments.
Thank you. Maybe I'd like to shift the debate to the pro and cons and migration for Europe, the pro and cons and migration policies, to both legal issues, respect of law, and also to ground realities outside of Europe globally. First, there are a lot of measures which have been implemented by the EU in partnership with third countries, and maybe the next pact itself, which may not be fully abiding with international law, with international humanitarian law, and with human rights generally. I just will take a few examples. I mean, Europe has obligations too. It's not an isolated continent. It's not the top legal continent in comparison to others. So there are other parts of the world which have laws too, and we are supposed to respect treaties and so on. When Europe has delivered more than 30 military vessels to the Libyan militias, there is no state in Libya, and those vessels are used literally to operate pushbacks to Libya, to detention centers, to illegal detention centers. They have also been directly killing people. This year, those vessels have shot 5 times at European rescue vessels, NGO vessels. Fortunately, nobody has been killed, but I wonder if Europe will react if a European sailor or rescuer is killed one day, and it will happen soon. Will Europe react then? Maybe. But these deliveries, these supplies of military vessels, are violating the United Nations Security Council embargo on Libya under Chapter 7. Is Europe above the United Security Council, the United Nations? No, I don't think it should be. All European Union member states are part of the United Nations. But currently, they have been violating the most important laws, I would say. Similarly, when Europe, maybe as Jose mentioned, blackmailed by the Moroccan king, is giving up the cause of Western Sahara, an invaded and occupied country, just for making migration deals, is the European Union then, which example is it giving to Africa and others? Is it not giving the impression we have double standards? When Ukraine is invaded, is occupied, we react, but not when other countries are. I mean, this is really a main concern. And I would be, let's imagine I am a European or a European Union member state diplomat. My interest and my task is to build real partnership and to have friendly relations with different African countries. These migration measures and the pact will not help me at all. I have to look at ground realities. In all the Sahel, from Guinea to Niger, all countries are turning against Europe, getting closer to Russia, to China as well. And those migration policies did not help at all. As we mentioned, we had a coup in Niger. Tunisia is becoming increasingly authoritarian. Egypt as well, and it's very messy too. I mean, states are criminalizing. In Libya, the same militias we used as border guards for Europe are trying to capture state institutions. It's not good for state building. In Sudan, there is a massive war, and it was questionable also for Europe to make a deal with a military Islamist junta whose president was under arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court. We had a deal with that regime until the moment it was toppled. And now the same forces we used to deal with, we used to meet, we used to invite to Europe, are fighting each other and performing another episode of mass ethnic killing. So it's not in our interests. Plus, it's provoking new, very legitimate flows of asylum seekers toward Europe. My interest as a European, if I would be a European diplomat, would be to take a bit of time to find good partners that will be stable democratic states in the south of the Mediterranean, and then only I should be allowed to discuss migration with them, with proper partners. But I would be really bothered if I would be a diplomat by, as Jose mentioned, my colleagues from interior ministries would tell me, I don't care of your diplomacy, I need a partnership right now with anyone. Would it be a militia, a dictator, or whatever? Let's do a partnership quickly, because this is what has happened. Thanks.
Okay, we have more questions, but we are running out of time. So I would ask to 3 people. Unfortunately, I think 3 is the most we can squeeze. Please keep it very short, and preferably if you have a person to direct the question to, it would be great.
Thank you very much. My name is Romy van Baars. I'm a journalist covering mostly the border violence in Greece. My question is to Mr. Lopez Aguilera, because I thought you made a really interesting point when you said we need to change the narrative, that we are underestimating it, but that it really matters. And I'm wondering what I am missing in the narrative right now is our own responsibility for attracting these people on the move. So, for example, if I want to eat strawberries every day, or when I order my package online and I expect it to arrive at my home the next day, we need to understand that this creates opportunities for people to come into Europe. And I wonder why barely no one in the European Parliament, and also not in this European Migration Pact, is talking about solutions like degrowth as a solution, which will, by the way, also save our climate. But I don't really hear this kind of narrative right now. So that would be my first question. And the second question is that you said the Migration Pact is not ideal, but we need European rights to also get things into the European Court. And I'm wondering, because as we know, countries like Greece has not been following the European law for years now. I think you were even there in November 2021 when when Cornelia Ernst was found people in the bushes and the rest of the group was pushed back. So I wonder what makes you think that this European Migration Pact will change anything about that? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sandra Kaduri from Keeping Channels Open, a dialogue network after Brexit. I'm from UK. Brexit was partly caused by exploitation of fears of loss of control over migration. So there's been real consequences. I think we're a bit unrealistic to think a lot of these fears and are going to go away overnight. And I wanted to know, what is the plan of action to clear up the misinformation, to start to lay the groundwork for narratives? Because honestly, we can see it happening all across Europe now, the nationalists exploiting that. And unless we deal with that, I don't think we should expect anything other than a restrictive migration policy in Europe. And I think it's unrealistic otherwise. But I'd like to hear pushback on that. And how do we change minds? Because it's going to take a number of years.
Thank you all. My name is Derval O'Callaghan. I'm from the European Peacebuilding Liaison Office. And I wanted to refer to the comments of Mr. Aguilar, who mentioned some of the crises facing the world in general: drought, climate change, warfare. And you said we can't overcome these structural challenges, we have to handle them. And I think in the EU lately, we've seen a sort of perhaps a more pragmatic approach, recognizing limitations of what can be done. But this has meant huge holes in humanitarian budgets, a sort of paralysis when it comes to engaging in fragile and conflict affected states, huge problems in terms of reducing the budget for conflict prevention and peace building. So if we continue down this path, what do you think the implementation of this pact and the challenges for it will look like in 10 years' time, say? Thank you.
Again, thank you so much for the points and the concerns expressed. And humbly, let me just tell you that as your representative in European Parliament, your concerns are mine. That is usually the case when I engage in an open talk with people that are armed with their own thoughts and their experiences. They have dwelled on challenging issues for years, and they speak up, raising concerns that are to be addressed. And that is one of the dimensions of the kind of political role that I have been playing for some years now. You know, I have my own line of thinking, I have my values, I have my biography, just like every one of you. But I came to the European Parliament also assuming that I was to be accountable for policy and lawmaking. And that's what I try to do my best. But the European Parliament, you know, is the only directly elected body in the European architecture. It represents directly, democratically. We had elections just some month ago at a huge scale of representation. So the European Parliament is unique in the world exactly for that, because it's the only supranational, directly elected lawmaking body in the world. It represents 450 million European citizens in 27 member states. You can't think of any scale of representation which is more varied and complex as that. The member states have not dissolved. They do stay. They remain existing. And they are to combine with the European legislation, which is meant to be binding for them all. Of course, they resist. Of course, they violate EU laws. Of course, they somehow try to escape their legal obligations by all of the means and tools at their disposal. And of course, we have to go again all the way, every step up the ladder. The European Commission, guardian of the treaties, do something. What are you doing about this? Don't you see what they're doing? They're violating EU law. Besides, they're violating international humanitarian law. Take them to the International Court. Take them to the European Court of Justice. Activate infringement procedures, fines. Engage in the so-called structured dialogue with that guy violating EU law. Prime Minister violating obviously EU laws. That's the way we do things at a European scale. Complex, dissatisfactory as it might seem, that is how we do things at a European scale. It's not my it's not my responsibility now to justify that complexity. But at times it takes just a second to remind you that's the way we do European law, and that's the way we engage in European politics. We engage with prime ministers which violate EU law regularly. And of course, we contradict them. We engage in a fight with them. We put them to trial. We bring them to justice, to EU court, and all that. Okay, then that is the premise. Then the second point is that you made a mention of Greece misbehaving. Not the only one. And there is no country which is exempt from criticism when it comes to this. But let me insist. Despite I didn't talk of I didn't talk of the migration pact as a miracle. Not at all. But of course, it was extremely difficult, and it actually was the hardest thing to do ever in the European Parliament experience. There has never been such a divisive issue in every possible way, and so the result cannot be perfect nor satisfactory. Not for me, but at least I insist. It's better to have EU laws which are supposedly the new leveling play field in which we can actually hold the member states accountable, national governments accountable, and create a new legal culture which is to be endorsed by the European Commission in the implementation plan with the cooperation with the member states, so that the Migration and Asylum Pact can actually be implemented with all of these difficulties and shortcomings. It'll be better than nothing. And again, a point on the African dimension. Of course, I try to refer to that point. You cannot do better if you do not know better and you do not understand better the complexity of the global dimension of migratory routes. In the European, believe me, in the European member states and the European public opinion, it is often the case that citizens are invited by the social nets and by the media and by the public opinion shape regularly to represent migration as an European issue. Most Europeans think that migrants are aiming Europe all across the world. That is, of course, nothing to do with the facts, nothing to do with the truth. Migration is a global issue, and of course there is an Asian dimension of migration. There's an internal African dimension of migration. We should know better, we should understand better, and we should exchange good practices and experiences in order to understand how to handle this. What I meant by handling this, not overcoming, is that I have referred many times, I have talked many times to interior ministers of the European Union, and believe me, explicitly in their speech, they make the point that their political aim should be reducing migration to zero. That would be my aim, so that I could somehow appease my citizens, my constituents, by reducing this problem to zero. That is absurd, preposterous. It cannot be done. That's what I meant. Migration cannot be reduced to zero ever in human history. Migration has always been a fact in human history. It will always be there. Most in global world, in the globalization, which is the ultimate dimension of human affairs, migration cannot be reduced to zero. We have to handle migration. We cannot have the aspiration of, hey, listen, Europeans, I have good news. We have sorted out the issue. They're not coming anymore. Just calm down. They're not coming. That's absurd. It's never going to happen. But believe me, there are interior ministers around the Council of Ministers which have that kind of rhetoric. That would be my aim. That is absurd. That cannot be done. We have to handle this. And we have to handle only if we do it together, because there is no individual or bilateral response to that. It has to be handled together. That is the point I wanted to make. Thank you. I'm compelled to end up. So I thank you for your attention.
In the name of gender balance and coffee,
I do love a little conspiracy. We are at 11:15, so it won't be for us to delay you. Yes, I will just respond to the issue that you raised around Brexit. I will start by saying, and bear with me here, I had some mild schadenfreude when I arrived on Sunday, because I landed from London and I was in a queue with British people that were complaining about the immigration queue. And I just couldn't resist it. I just couldn't. Also coming from 2 former British colonies, it was a little bit too sweet. But on misinformation, I I think one of the main issues, to be honest, is the ways in which we try to counter misinformation. Often people resort to referring to the data or the numbers in a way to counter misinformation. But the thing about misinformation is it doesn't need 1 million people to perpetrate those crimes. It only needs one. And that is where fundamentally, I think on our side, often we make the mistake of trying to counter misinformation by diminishing the act. Let me put it that way. So by saying, look, we recognize that crime is committed and all of that, and migrants may commit crimes, but it's not that bad, which actually doesn't counter misinformation, because for a victim of crime, when you do impact studies, they don't frankly care how many other victims exist. They are the person directly impacted. So when people use emotional messaging around the acts, for example, more recently, where a Syrian asylum seeker is found to have been responsible for the crime, that then takes over. The better ways to counter that is not to focus just on that act, but really my answer earlier to the question posed was around the emphasis that is placed on the elements of migration from which we benefit, quite frankly, because once you try to do a tit for tat in respect of countering misinformation, you won't win, because still someone will say, I hear you, but, and I think that is where fundamentally we need to be doing a lot better. And a lot of the misinformation circulates through personal networks over anything else. So when someone who is from outside that network comes in and attempts to say, well, actually, you're all wrong, it comes off as quite condescending and patronizing. But like I said, now we're 2 minutes into our coffee break, and I'm not running for election, so I think I'm done.
Thanks. So maybe very quickly on the same issue. I mean, for me, I don't have a problem that the far right is racist or xenophobic. I mean, it's their nature. But what I have a problem when decision makers from the right or the left or the center are telling me, okay, because the far right is rising, we have to do what they ask. This is a problem. And it's not working. I mean, we have a saying in France, we say voters do prefer the original to the copy. And it's what happened in Italy. The Italian policy with Libya that I described was implemented by a minister, Marco Minniti, initially from the far left, let's say from the left. And he openly told us, I will do this so that the far right does not win the next vote. They won. He lost. And they thanked him. They even said, we don't have anything to do anymore. He did everything.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for our speakers. A big applause to them. And a long-awaited coffee is just around the corner, and we're meeting back here at 11:30. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming back in the room and finding your place again. I would propose, if there are last people outside that want to join, this would be the moment. Otherwise, we will start in the next seconds. All right, looks great. Yeah. Also, a very warm welcome from my side. I'm Tobias Bela. I'm the Policy Officer for Migration and Integration at the Friedrich Ebert Foundation that is co-organizing this event and the Progressive Migration Group with FEPS. And I welcome you back to the second panel that is on a migrant-centered approach to legal pathways and labor migration. Also, very happy to see so many different stakeholders from different fields here in the room. And I hope that we have a very fruitful and interesting discussion later on. So after the panel of this morning, that was mainly focusing on EU asylum and migration policies and its impact on African countries, now we will have a look at mainly labor migration and legal pathways, but also with a view on the African-European dynamics in this regard. And with me on the panel, I like to welcome two members of the Progressive Migration Group, which is Paddy Sianga Knudsen, development economist and migration governance expert, and Ferruccio Pastore, director of the International and European Forum on Migration Research, FIERI, in Italy. And also I would like to welcome Mercedes Miletti, a senior advisor on, among other things, migration and coordinator of the Union Migration Network at the European Trade Union Confederation, and online Antje Grother, president of the Bremen Parliament and rapporteur on the Common Implementation Plan for the Pact on Migration and Asylum, the local and regional perspective at the Committee of the Regions. I'm very glad you could join us today for this timely discussion. Thank you very much. And shortly, we will also start to hear some opening statements from our panelists, beginning with Paddy, then Ferruccio Pastore, afterwards Mercedes Miletti, and closing with Antje Grother. And afterwards, I would, similarly to the first panel, open the floor to questions and comments from your side. And then around 1 o'clock, maybe 1:10, I would give the floor to Anna Taron Cusi, who's sitting here in the front, who is a senior fellow at the Migration Policy Institute and former Secretary of State for Immigration and Emigration of the government of Spain, who will give the concluding remarks on this panel. And then we have a joint dinner if you would like to stay. Dinner, lunch, I mean, sorry. Already jumping in time. No, then we have a joint lunch if you would like to stay, and you're very much invited to join this lunch with us. Therefore, without further ado, Paddy, you have the floor, and I'm very interested in what you have to share with us.
Tobias, thank you. Good morning, everyone. And also, yeah, it's good to be in Brussels. So migrant-centered approach to legal pathways and labor migration. I think we've heard a lot this morning about comprehensive agreements. And there seems to have been a lot of inspiration coming from the European Commission itself, out of different spaces as well, and what that should mean. I pause a bit and ask, comprehensive for who? And I think as we move towards that, I ask myself, is what a win-win situation is. A win-win for Europe and Africa, or is it a win-win for Europe and Europe only? So I wanted to just put that in perspective as we talk about it, because in a lot of ways, we've been digesting comprehensive agreements as a way of probably trying to leverage and to deal with the complexities that migration governance migration and migration trends have shown us. But at the same time, trying to say from the African perspective that comprehensive agreements have to actually be intentional. And so we cannot lump these issues together without, first of all, accepting that there's been systematic failure and also the unfounded fear of losing control of EU borders, as we heard this morning. Another thing we need to understand as we talk about comprehensive agreements and what that looks like in different forms in Europe with different African countries is that comprehensive agreements cannot be based on an opportunistic approach. And what is that? From the African perspective, we really are looking for that move towards equitable partnerships. We understand they cannot be equal, but equity is definitely an essential ingredient in that. Why? Because that's the only way we can fit the African agenda and avoid that it's one-sided, just looking at Europe's needs. We also have heard this morning how Europe is not the only destination for Africa, and by the way, is also not the only aging population. So there's a lot of ground that African migrants and those seeking opportunities could look towards to. On the European side, I think what we see from the African side is that there's quite an obsession, and I think we've talked a lot about it in terms of being efficient in returns. And while this is not really seen, is not really seen as a smart move. Why do I say that? Many of migrants who've been in a waiting mode have invested, they've skilled up, some even learning languages, learning languages where they have been. I'm living in Germany, so I know what challenge that poses. If you stay a year in Germany, you can go a little bit beyond saying Entschuldigung. That's sorry for German, it's my favorite word. But also you begin to integrate in this gray area zone as your papers are being documented. So I ask myself, many moving with qualifications, wouldn't it be smart to retain those that are needed for Europe's labor market and send those who really, really volunteer to go home? So questions around voluntary returns and what that looks like. And also throwing in there that there is a magic in regularization, which is, by the way, a twin objective of regular pathways. So what do we need to do in terms of prioritizing labor migration that really looks like what the migrants want it to look like? I won't take too much time. I think you all have the leaflet. So encouraging you once again to read the recommendations from the Progressive Migration Group. There's lots in there. And we hope that you may resonate with a lot of the recommendations in there that go across conditionality, addressing conditionality, looking at more inclusive policies, social protection, but also that encouragement on brain and skill circulation to avoid brain drain and brain waste, which are realities for migrants. What is key? I think it's critical to realize that we need to shift the narrative. Luckily, my minutes won't dwell in that because we've talked a lot about it in terms of benefits of migration and misinformation and how to counter that. But also at the same time to realize that Africa is not a passive partner. Africa is not just young and vibrant, but there's a lot of voices in there, from the people to the subnational governments, to its civil society, its trade unions, its diaspora. And so there's a lot of diversity of voices in there. And even on the state side, diversity does actually exist. So despite the silence that we see or the lack of response on pacts and pools and talent partnerships from the Africa side, we are not silent. We're just busy with other things and other priorities. Then let me lastly zoom in on Germany and Kenya partnerships. Why? Because I think this is quite an interesting depiction of Germany's current roadshow, not only in Africa, but in Asia and also just around in the Balkans, in trying to solve its problem on labor shortages. So the Kenya and Germany are going to sign the agreement. I think President William Ruto will be in Germany. Definitely limited development emphasis in these agreements, very little about social protection, but it's still a good buzzwords on both sides, particularly on the Kenyan side. But what that looks like, it hasn't been thought through. What the actual number, the sectors, remains pretty vague. So let's see what happens when the agreement is actually signed. In terms of what can we learn? Kenya has signed these kind of agreements before. It's not the first time. They've signed actually one with professionals. So nurses moving to the United Kingdom, you can Google that and you will see that only 200 have made it through. So buzzwords really need to be accompanied by extra effort. What does extra effort mean? We can talk a bit about infrastructure. Yes, it's about integrating migrants, what those social needs look like, but even before they land on the territory, did we think about the visa? The capacity that we see on from the Schengen side is very limited. Rejections are very high for obvious cases. The risk assessment that's being applied even to people coming for conferences just doesn't make any sense. And I wonder what happens if 250,000 descend upon any embassy in an African country to get visas. Probably the embassy closes. But then also looking at the fact that there is very little emphasis on job matching, the strenuous language requirements for job seekers that seem to be very light. To be told you need an A2 in German, try that and see. And also thinking a lot about the engagement of countries of origin. And here, Kenya has really been vibrant in going out throughout the regions of Kenya, doing job fairs and trying to get people motivated, hashtags, kazi maju in Swahili, which means jobs abroad. But we all know that that doesn't really translate into real jobs. And at the same time, consular support is very limited. But what is most critical is how will labor migration be dealt with? You don't have labor migration attaches in embassies that would deal with the multitudes of problems. What about integration lessons? What can we learn? Germany has signed these kind of agreements before. IT professionals from India, what do the German society think about that? Where are they? Where are the professionals today? Some stayed, some moved on to greener pastures, and some returned. What can we learn from there? What about the women? More women will come given the nature of the job. So there's issues around feminization of migration, but that means we should look at vulnerability, particularly when there's a lot of misinformation around visa facilitation. So we know what that will mean, but also looking at the power of agency and what that will mean in terms of looking at the power that migration has in terms of remittances, but also the burden that comes with migrants doing continued care for their families back home, but also very important, the benefits of social impact projects back home. I will end with two things. One, the role of the diaspora and migrant communities in all this. Why is that important? Their voices, their inputs are critical, not just when migrants have landed, but also critically in the negotiation. And that's been a bit of a closed space for migrants and diaspora actors to get their voice in. But there are partners that are trying to bring these voices more. We see diaspora not just as a backup plan when, for embassies, when things fail, or a help desk for municipalities that they work with when migrants cannot effectively integrate. But they're a critical part that is essential to change minds, perceptions, and votes, as well as to bridge cultural practices and really make Europe a multicultural, give Europe its multicultural cities. I'll end with two questions. Are countries of destination, us here in this room that live in Europe, are we ready for multicultural and multicolored society? Are we? Are we ready to look different? Or would European societies rather look forward to be cared by robots in hospitals, care homes, and offices and supermarkets? I definitely hope not, because I think most of us are heading to our 60s at some point.
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks, Tobias. Good morning. The session is about ask a question which is not meant to be provocative, but factual, and of labor migration, which is and will remain state-centered for the next future. So it's mainly about what member states want to make out of it. But still, having said this, which is I think a fundamental preamble, it's still relevant to speak about a migrant-centered approach. What do we mean by a migrant-centered approach to labor migration? Well, one first way to understand this is what Paddy said. So an approach, a labor migration model, which is aware and which is prioritizing preferences, individual talents, and competencies of the migrants themselves, of the candidate migrants themselves. And this is a must, of course. But then there is a second level, if you want a more technical way to understand a migrant-centered approach to labor migration, and this is what I'm focusing now in my few words. And in this sense, migrant-centered means migrant-driven. As opposed to two other ways to understand, to design a labor migration model, which is bureaucracy-driven or employer-driven, or if you want, driven by labor agencies. And as a matter of fact, most recruitment models in the European Union, in member states, are for workers from third countries, are actually employer-driven or bureaucracy-driven. The latter, for instance, is the case with most circular migration schemes, which are, typically heavily hyper-regulated in order to reduce risks of overstaying, basically. But that this over-regulation leads to very high costs and very, very cumbersome procedures and very limited opportunities for upscale. So the problem with this, focusing on bureaucracy-driven and employer-driven models, where it is either the bureaucracy which chooses who and when migrates, or the employer, not the migrant, the problem is that they don't work. I mean, decades of experiments done at national level in several member states show that only large employers have the financial and organizational resources to actually effectively carry out training abroad and selection abroad. But the majority of employers in most member states, at least, who are potentially interested in third country national workers are small employers, small enterprises, maybe medium enterprises, and families looking for care workers. This is, vast market. And by now, everybody acknowledges this. But these kind of employers don't have the resources to go set up a training center abroad or a selection center abroad. But in the meantime, they don't trust workers whom they don't know, whom they have seen in advance. And in this case, online registers of expressions of interest, or a talent pool, a digital talent pool, which is the kind of solution that are being debated currently at European level, at EU level, is not enough. And the Commission is all professionals in the field are very much aware of this. If you read the impact assessment of the talent pool regulation, it's clearly said, I mean, we do this, but I can also, without an implementing tool that supports the matching of EU employers with third country national, realizing the full potential of the 10 migration partnerships that we, the Commission says, aim to have in place before 2030, will be very difficult. I would say almost impossible in most cases. So, and even worse, if you have a recruitment channel open, but you have no effective matching mechanism, what happens is that the whole machinery is likely to generate abuses, generate scams. And this is what is happening. Because if there is no effective intermediation mechanism, public or public-private, but transparent, it will be non-transparent actors or even criminal actors who will take up the intermediation function. And this is what happens. In fact, I mean, I'm from Italy, and in Italy, the whole, mechanism of annual planning decrees, so-called decreto flussi, flows decree, is, hijacked by fake employer who offer fake jobs. And of course, this is not for free. So, so my argument, our argument, I think we discussed it also in the context of this group, is that migrant-driven mechanisms could be more efficient. But of course, how could it be done? Of course, we are not talking of a free movement area, which is the pure form of migrant-driven admission system, because it's the migrant who decides who and when and how she or he moves to look for a job. But we could think of less radical, maybe, models in which, for instance, there is a temporary admission of qualified and vetted candidates for limited periods of supplementary training in Europe, but followed by a period of job search, in which the selected candidate is allowed to go himself or herself looking for a job, to operate this matching that cannot be effectively operated transnational. Of course, the killing objection here is, what if this person doesn't find a job and then doesn't come back? This is, the return obsession that was, talked about in the previous session. But in the case of a hypothetical migrant-driven mechanism, in any case, labor candidates would be known to the authorities from the start, would be identified, and then would be easily tracked. And you could also think of nudge systems in order to encourage compliance. I mean, you have a priority to try again if you comply after an unsuccessful job-seeking period. So all of this is very complicated. We are fully aware of that. I mean, we are fully aware that all this will be dismissed as naive or even provocative, by many officials. But we think that the tension, the contradiction between European human shortages, not just labor shortages, but demographic shortages, and the current cumbersome nature and inefficiency of admission system, labor migration systems, is growing unsustainable. This distance, this tension, and political courage is needed, but also thinking out of the box is needed. And this is what I think this group has been trying to do. Thank you.
I'm happy that this panel has, we have the gender balance. I'm happy, but I won't be able to use more time to speak. So no, I will be, good morning from my side. I would really like to be quick. Also, I think it's always better to have the kind of interaction and dialogue. And also, we have also our colleague speaking after me. I will bring a little bit the perspective of the European Trade Union Confederation. I don't know if many of you know about it, but the ETUC will represent almost 45 million workers, and I'm the person responsible for the migration dossier. And also we have a union migrant net, as Tobias mentioned. So I always tried also in my discussions with the Commission and other policy making colleagues in Brussels, trying to bring what is happening on the ground. And so, as I think Ferruccio was saying, and I very much agree with the Progressive Migration Group, the recommendations that I read, we need, I think, and that is lacking, not only the migrant, center approach to labor migration, but we have very few regular labor migration, pathways, and so we have seen that with all this obsession that we have discussed before in terms of the border controls, returns, the whole securitarian approach. And I was actually reading the guidelines of von der Leyen, where I was trying to do control find and seeing the security word was, I don't know, popping out at least 20 times or even more, and integration was only once. And so, of course, this, it's part of what we are seeing, I think, unfortunately, and at least on the last Commission, I was particularly involved in one of the few files in terms of labor migration, which is the revision of the single permit directive, which actually was not opening more channels, but it was in a way to enhance, so to say, the protection and of the migrant worker to come in and reside, with this, so to say, less bureaucratic, having one residence and working permit. And actually the EU talent pool, which is still now, hopefully, or I don't know if hopefully, but there was some political agreement, and there will start some trilogues coming soon with the parliament. But we have always been saying for the beginning that we don't need an EU talent pool. That will not be the solution when we are talking about the whole, so to say, approach to labor migration, but also asylum, only to provide a new a matching tool, employer-driven, where actually there are very few safeguards in terms of the prevention of abuses and exploitation. And I think this is where I probably would like to put my emphasis, which, as in the recommendations, you talk about enhanced migrant protection and working conditions. I think what we see and what I hear from the ground, we know the situation in which many migrant workers, and I'm including those undocumented, face abuses and exploitation. And even, people dying. And I was thinking of unfortunately, in the agricultural sector in Italy, where people are left totally in, basically to die in the street. So I think like, and particularly the talent pool, bringing into a little bit of the labor shortages, which is also this buzzword now, the idea like to bring cheap labor. And that's what we are seeing, like the kind of narrative, and again, talking about narratives, it's like, this is what we need, the employers, and particularly because our dialogue is with, Business Europe and other organizations represented at European level, that is like, we are struggling into find the skills and the talents that we need. This is also something that we try to change, saying like, this is not only about the talent, this is not only about the highly skilled, this is about people. Everyone has skills, everyone has competencies, but I think it's difficult to, to make them understand that, we really need to have a conversation and policies, but I'm not seeing that this coming in the next commission, that we are really looking into new possibilities for labor migration into Europe. We always say we need more across the skills levels and across sectors, we need more possibilities. Now it's all about partnerships, these partnerships that actually, as you know, I don't want to repeat what we are saying, but they are looking into only one side of the partnership. So I think we really need to have a comprehensive a dialogue and approach. And I think it's important also, I think you mentioned it, regularization. We always talking about, maybe also new labor migration or new legal pathways, but I think how many, irregular migrants are living, are performing jobs, particularly also, as we know, in the care and domestic sector, but also in others. We really need to, find solutions, and we really need to, demystify regularization. We really need to provide for those, working permits, and particularly, at least me, on the discussions within the single permit, it was even difficult to provide for the right to change an employer in case of abuses and exploitation. It was difficult to allow for a time for the person to search for a job. So really, like the basics, and the basics, unfortunately, is because migrants are not treated equally. It's like this, and also as a trade union, we always, try to talk about equal treatment. And so this is where it's lacking. And I think there is a lot of also political, of course, reluctancy to provide that. And that, of course, is linked to access to services, social protection, and etc. So I think I will stop here. I'm happy to get into the questions and dialogue with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning from Bremen, where I unfortunately have to be because I have the committee meeting in the afternoon. Let me first of all start with, for my side, most important point, which means that we have to talk about the benefits of migration for both the migrants and the host communities. We have to change the narrative for that. That is very important. And that means we have to put an emphasis on the positive outcome of migrant integration, and take into account the needs and rights of migrants and the realities of the local communities that welcome them. We need to adopt an inclusive rights-based approach that prioritizes mutual cooperation, respect for human rights, and inherent dignity of all individuals involved. So let us be clear. We need a future-oriented migration policy that can respond to current societal and global challenges. Of course, we have to have legal pathways. We have to have safe pathways, as well as the integration of those legally residing in the EU. And we must disincentivize irregular arrivals and combat migrant smuggling, which is also a very important part of the discussion we're having at the moment. This means that we have to involve our local and regional communities, which is, of course, my part in the discussion, because they are the ones who have to effectively manage migration. And to be able to play our role to the full, we need to be empowered in terms of resources, of course, both human and financial, proper training and infrastructures in a context of effective multi-level governance. Because as I already mentioned, we need to facilitate legal migration and offer opportunities for people with skills that can meet the demands of local communities throughout Europe. We observed the benefits of this approach with healthcare workers during the COVID crisis. You all know that. It is also important, and this was already mentioned, to offer learning opportunities to those that are arriving but less skilled, or maybe those qualifications are not recognized in Europe, which we also see today. And we have many countries in Europe which have already labor shortages and employment gaps. And this could be addressed through effective integration and inclusion policies. That does not mean that we only have to accept people who are perfectly skilled for now, but we can also talk about migrants who want to be educated, who want to be trained on the jobs, and who want to take part in that, what is necessary for what we as the European community need. So we're strictly working on that. And we have to also deal with people who are fleeing from conflicts, because we have them also. It's not all about labor migration, but it's mostly people fleeing from situations of conflict, political or financial instability. And these persons, of course, may have legitimate claims to international protection. So we have to find a way to integrate them as well. And there are people with specific needs. Maybe there are people who need specific legal protection, who are somehow more vulnerable than others. So they need to be treated in a way that it works for them as well. And we must ensure that they have all the access to the situation, to the services they need. So they will have a good start in Europe. Our very own Cities and Regions for Integration initiative provides a political platform for European mayors and regional leaders to showcase positive examples of integration of migrants and refugees, share relevant information, and promote diversity as an added value to building inclusive cities and ensuring social cohesion. By fostering such initiatives and focusing on migrant-centered policies, we can develop sustainable solutions that strengthen societal cohesion and build rich and inclusive communities. Bremen is also part of the Cities of Safe Harbors initiative, which believes that migrant-centered approach is crucial for fostering societal cohesion. We implement a holistic strategy that ensures equal opportunities for both new arrivals and local citizens, leveraging their talents and skills to enrich our community. And I cannot stress enough how important the diaspora communities are in this process, because they're the ones who experience the same difficulties newcomers experience. They are able to reach them on a different level, on another level than we as the people who were like grown-ups here in our cities and our regions are, because they know the cultural misunderstandings. They know better about finding the pathway through our legal system, and they know how misunderstandings can create very, very, very big difficulties. So from my perspective, it's very important to involve the whole society and to even specially address our diaspora communities to help them out with that. So let me just have a short note about social protection for newcomers in Europe. I started with the diaspora because they are always the people the newcomers look for advice. But still, we have to make sure that we guarantee access to social protection, which requires a coordination between local, regional, and national authorities. And newcomers should be provided with clear information about their rights and the legal protections available to them. And that does not matter if you're like a refugee searching for security or if you're a labor migrant, but you have to know your rights and you have to know how to navigate through them. So it means free legal assistance and counseling in a language those newcomers understand, and that they can navigate their new environment with. It has also to talk about long-term social protection, language classes, cultural orientation, vocational training if needed, so they can have a good start and they can make their livings affordable and build a living on their own. That means, of course, economic stability is a key to long-term social protection. In Bremen, for example, the German Red Cross, in collaboration with local partners, established the Bremer and Bremerhavener Integration Network to help migrants navigate administrative barriers and the labor market, which was very successful and is always monitored if this could be a positive example how to do it. This network facilitates vocational training and promotes hiring of migrants to meet regional demand for skilled workers. And we have employers working with this organization and saying what they especially need and what they are looking for. So not to be too long, I would just say that we have to have tailored programs collecting data to know which situation worked and which didn't work, so we can create a supportive environment not only for the newcomers but also for the people who are already here, that they see there is no either or, but and we are all in this together, and we can work it together, and we can have a beneficial outcome out of the situation. So I think I would stop by that, not to be too long. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much for this intervention and these interventions. And also thank you very much for all these recommendations that seem to already fix the problem, actually. Hopefully, or at least give a certain idea for the way forward. Also, because gender balance came up sometimes, we thought of gender balance in terms of the whole 2 panels. And if you might see, there are 3 women on the panel now. So that's why there were 3 men on the panel before. But just to somehow explain why there was not a gender balance on the panel. That's true. So without further ado, I would open the floor for any questions, comments, maybe also other recommendations. And I already have a question here.
Thank you. Yes, I would like to ask a question on behalf of Ibrahim Kasso, who is one of our progressive migration group members who cannot be here at the moment because of the visa issue. So he's a project operations coordinator for the Regional Migration Fund at the Intergovernmental Authority for Development. And his question is, has externalization policy served the purpose it was supposed to serve? And if you have any feedback on the EU agreement with Tunisia. Thank you.
Hi, hello. My name is Adrian. I'm a journalist for independent media Vox Europe. Thank you all for your insights. I believe they're very precious in the troubled debate on migration we see today. My question will be this. We mentioned, in progressive circles, there is an argument to be made for more migration because the population in Europe is aging, which is true. We need more people to fill in the gaps in the work market. But at the same time, I believe you mentioned fighting the brain drain that we might provoke by welcoming more workers from abroad, from third countries. So how do we make sense of this? How do we, at the same time, manage to get more professionals and sometimes very highly qualified professionals? We mentioned healthcare workers, but people elsewhere need healthcare workers, obviously. So how do we fight brain drain and at the same time manage to get the workers we need in Europe today? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Ahmad. Again, I'm discussing. Thank you for the insight. What you have discussed, especially the last speaker. I want to add. Yeah. Thank you. I want to add that really there are lots of barriers before the immigrant to engage in the community or integrate in the community, especially the language problems, the culture, the cultural problems. So there are lots of issues what you have soon discussed. But let me, what are the solutions? Still, the programs what many countries have provided, like language class, everything, that's sometimes that's not really positive. So it takes a lot of time. For example, my document, it's about 1 year that verified. So many people come from other countries with a big capacity, but it takes a lot of time to be involved in the community and work. It is both effective, as you discussed, for the government, for these countries, and for the immigrant. The second issue, sense of ownership. How we can improve the level of sense of ownership between these the immigrants. I see a lot of people who are working, but right now they don't know how to be with the heart working for the country and be involved in the country. The sense of ownership is the other problems, I think. How we can improve this level of sense of ownership between these immigrants. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This was a very interesting panel. So I'm Melissa Martineau for the UN Refugee Agency, and I work on the topic of refugee labor mobility. And I think we talked this morning in the first panel about how, a lot of African states are the largest refugee hosting countries. And I think it's really important that when we think of migration opportunity, we think of migration opportunity for all types of population who are also looking for opportunities based on their skills and talents. So how can we make sure that also refugees sitting in African countries have access to this opportunity, especially in the framework of these bilateral agreements, right, between European states and single African countries? But also, I wanted just to make a remark, because I think we talked a lot in this panel about the structure of support that needs to be set up in Europe once people arrive. But I think it's very important as well that when we think of this partnership, we think also of what investment needs to be made in sourcing country, in African countries, to prepare migrants for these opportunities, so they understand what their rights are once they arrive in Europe. So they can, and also how can we ensure that the upskilling being done or the training being done in those countries fits the needs of Europe, so people can more easily, like there is a lot of background work to be done. And I think in the past, it was easy to ignore it because we assumed that everybody would only have Europe as a choice to come. But now the question of Europe's attractability is really at the center of the migration discourse. And we can really try and push this question of how is Europe investing into making this migration opportunity actually easier. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would quickly hand the microphone over to you in a second. Just since we have 4 questions now, you can also just select the question that you want to answer to. And I would start maybe with Patty.
Thank you. Not easy to go first, but here goes. I think in terms of results of externalization, a lot can be said and a lot has also been written. And I would encourage you to look into research that's been written by, various researchers have tried to look at the impact of externalization, for instance, from the perspective of free movement in sub-Saharan Africa, with a particular focus, for instance, on ECOWAS. What has that meant in terms of restrictive movements? As you know, in Africa, we have the free movement protocol, which obviously has not been adopted by many member states, but at the sub-regional level, you have movement protocols that should allow members of those countries to be able to move, a bit like mini EU. And what externalization has done is to restrict those kind of movements. And there's much more that could be said around that. But I thought that, to zoom in a little bit more on issues around brain drain, I struggle a bit with this, and I'll tell you why. Because a lot of times I'm not really sure what data is being looked at. And I will talk about my home country, Zambia. When the WHO had put quite a number of countries on what they called a red list, so you cannot employ health professionals from that particular country, they had included Zambia. And from the nurses associations from various places that are representing nurses that have traveled abroad and are working abroad, it was very difficult to understand where this data had come from, because you could obviously see a lot of nurses or those who had qualified as nurses coming out of different institutions within the country and also just in neighboring countries. We're surrounded by 9 countries, and some of them offer good courses around that. And so you actually had the public sector could not just take the number of nurses that was there. And so we had a ban, sort of, if you could look at that way, a ban to export nurses. And then not too long after, we had an agreement with Angola to export nurses. So it's a bit, I think that a lot of it has to do with data. And so I think my response to that would be, we really need to look at data in terms of making any kind of policies, and policies just have to be supported by some kind of evidence. And here we also know that National Statistics Office are not usually well vested in data, and data is sort of sitting in different ministries. Maybe the Ministry of Health will be holding some kind of data that's not really sitting with the Ministry of Labor to get an understanding of who is being placed somewhere else. And then there is a public health institution that's charged with placement of nurses, but there's also private institutions that are just not able to take up that capacity. So just from that example, I'm not quite sure where some arguments around brain drain are actually coming from, but there is evidence. For instance, we have heard from the German-Moldova agreement, where the Moldovians had said, please don't touch our labor market if you can, Germany. We're just trying to grapple ourselves with the same labor you're looking for. So I think it's really important to have real data based on actual countries, actual communities, actual sectors, before we can understand better what's happening around brain drain. I think the same response goes to recognition of skills. I also do think that there's a lot of a generality around migrants arriving without skills. And I think, Melissa alluded to it, nobody in life is without a skill, but maybe the skill is just not acceptable for that particular type of job. But maybe that's also because they're not expected to accept that kind of skill. Commonwealth countries speak English. I come from a Commonwealth country. I mean, I'd say it's an English speaking country. Actually, I think it's the first time I've said it's a Commonwealth country. But a lot of us are subjected to English tests. Believe it or not, the language I'm communicating to you is not enough for me to enter any institution in the United Kingdom. Yeah, from 1st grade to 12th grade, you're taught nothing but English. In fact, you're punished for speaking vernacular. So, English tests, and the same goes for French-speaking countries. You still need to be able to pass that. In the US, you've got a lot of different. So all these access programs that basically say your skill is not good enough. And I think there's a whole conversation that has to be done around turning that particular aspect. And really, in terms of now, language skills aside, but also skills, the only thing I would say is that I wish it would just be the process would be as fast as getting your tax ID. I tried that in Germany. I think it took, in less than 10 days, I got my tax ID. I don't think skills recognition goes as fast. So that tells you a little bit more about where efficiency is applied. But I'm not coming from Bremen City. I'm coming from Bonn. So maybe that's another conversation. And then maybe very last, I struggle really with this thing of fitting the needs of Europe for skills. Africa wants skills for itself. I mean, again, yes, we are very happy to bring wonderful gardeners to the garden, but we also have gardens to take care of. And the concept of we give good skills and we keep what's left over, I think this really is part of that narrative change. And so skilling up in Africa we should be skilling for the future. Why don't we talk about that? And very lastly, to close, I think that's why we're often trying to move the conversation from migrants' rights based to a human rights conversation. Because if we say, for instance, we need to cater for the needs of the youth, that's very different when we say we need to cater for young migrants, or when we need to cater for women, or when we need to cater for a particular group, rather than really, I mean, so I think the human rights conversation is very important, and to have that in the back of their minds as we talk about migration and development.
Yeah, maybe I would just, just building a little bit of what you mentioned about the data. The perspective of Europe, might not happen. So this is always this in the dialogue when I was mentioning also with employers and in the social dialogue, and also with the Commission, also with these initiatives, was like, let's try to change that into, we have these labor shortages. We need to talk about working and employment conditions, improving wages, social protection is about health and safety. So, and because you mentioned the health, care sector, but it's also coming in the construction sector, it's in the agricultural food sector, so I think it's a little bit, but I agree with you that it's also like data, and not only on that, but in other fields is also very important, and it's lacking. And I think I just wanted to a little bit on the question, both on the I think it's important on the side of the prepare also, the colleague from the refugee, I think also we try, at least from our perspective, to build these networks. I'm talking about the trade unions, but also with the civil society organizations, networks that they're also in, so to say, in third country. And of course, again, from the trade union perspective, when we're talking about rights, labor rights, and empower people also, just to, it's important that they're informed about it. But that is also, sometimes it's difficult. Also, I see Tobias, I have my colleague also for the International Trade Union Confederation. We try to kind of build that networks, but also it's also sometimes the resources, lacking here and there to provide for that. But I think it's important that people are informed, and particularly again in the world of work, that they inform about the rights. And the living conditions in general, and again, a little bit on the sense of ownership and integration. That is true that it's not easy, and I think even for me, for example, even as an Argentinian, that I think inclusion, integration is not easy. Takes a lot of time, but I think it's also linked to that kind of possibility for, I think, political participation, among other things. So I think it's about, sometimes, it's so difficult, because you start from like, I just need a job, to, pay for this, my bills, or, if you have family. So I think it's also linked, at least on European policies and what we do, trying to, make that, possibility for people to have a, as I said, maybe, the civil participation, political participation. And I think that empowerment and ownership might happen. But I think it's true, there is a lot of basic also services, a little bit maybe also linked for the local and regional authorities. And, we are here, we are in Brussels. I don't know, you see the issue that we have with homelessness, housing. Asylum seekers are just like sleeping, roughly. So I think from the basics, it's also very difficult. I think we need to start, unfortunately, from the very basics, until we can also build that kind of more labor market integration and social inclusion for not only newcomers, but for, for other categories, or all, categories of migrants and asylum seekers and refugees.
Yeah, thank you. Let me take it from far. Yesterday, there was this drug report which started circulating, and the headline is, Europe needs 800 billion a year to stop its agony, or to prevent agony. So investment to prevent decline. I haven't seen the report yet. I don't know if it mentions migration. Migration is one of the areas in which Europe should invest to prevent agony. Europe has been free riding on migration for decades. I mean, this is particularly true for countries like mine, Italy, and other southern European countries or Eastern European countries, maybe to some extent more than Germany, for instance. But we have been free riding. We had a declining welfare. Let's invest on welfare. No, we take migrants. We had an economy lacking, technological innovation. Let's innovate. Let's invest in innovation. No, let's take migrants. So that was the pattern in many European countries. This is not enough anymore to stop the agony, to stop decline. So we need investment. What does this mean? I mean, it means, well, what Ahmed said is, I think, very important, because when an asylum seeker comes to our countries, he or she is targeted with conflicting imperatives or messages. On the one hand, you need to become self-reliant. You need to get out of here as soon as possible. So take whatever job. I know you have a degree, but I don't care. I mean, it's a sort of fake degree because it comes from a faraway country. Take this job as an agricultural worker or as a care worker, whatever. Survive. The other conflicting imperative is be productive. You need to gain your position in our society to be useful, to add something to our society. And clearly the two cannot go together. And in order to and the position of a person, whoever it is, he is, who finds himself or herself, targeted with such conflicting imperatives, is to be torn. And I can only.
Thank you very much for this statement. And Antje Grote, if you can hear us or speak.
It's working at the moment, but unfortunately I didn't hear lots of Ferruccio's statement because the audio was off. But if you can hear me now, can just one give me a thumbs up, one of the three panelists? Okay, thank you so much. So let me just give a short idea of my opinion about that. From what we experience in Germany, from what I know, we have lots of people still not coming by any legal pathway as a labor person integrating in our labor market. We still have the situation that most of the people arriving in Germany are people who are seeking refuge. And it's often very difficult to monitor or to find out what kind of certificates and what kind of skills they bring to the table, because those people normally do not bring documents where they can show what they did before they left their home countries. So that's part of the problem. And on the other hand, we have lots of young people coming who mostly just ended their school terms and then had to leave the country. So there's a big opportunity for them to fit in the special parts of labor we need, which is for us very important, and it's not all about getting nurses or doctors or IT specialists from other countries in terms of brain drain, but it's also from my perspective, to like live with the people we have. We want to integrate. So if there is one person who brings special skills, that's fine, and we have to check out how we can make that work within our society. And it's not mostly the language part, but this is a huge part of it, because I think most Germans speak English, but I could talk about my pain in like 3 different ways, maybe in English, but I could do that in like 15 ways in German, and that would all be a different kind of pain. I couldn't do that in English. So if a person who is working with me does not understand what pain I'm talking about, we have to find some interpreter or anything else, which we already do. But we have to see that we have lots of people who are coming from the same country where maybe the doctor or the nurse or whatever is coming from, who could then express their pain in their language. So it doesn't always have to be German, but we need some sort of working together to get the language done. That is the first part of it. second part of it is, if we have people coming into Germany who just left school and are trying for a possibility to work, we can do some sort of preparation courses, which also includes, and that is what we do in Bremen, which not only includes language courses, but also includes like some sort of internship, working on special things to become a craftsman or something like that, so that they can experience what they actually want to do. And we need lots of industrial workers also, so there's always the possibility to find out if that is what you like and what we need, because this mostly has to be a match to work. And the most important part for me is the moment you start working, the moment you start entering a school, you start speaking German. So, and that is why, from my perspective, the children pick up the language so fast, because that's the way they have to interact in schools. And the more we can make people enter the labor market, enter any kind of training, the more easily they will pick up the language, because they're used to use it. You know what I mean? You cannot learn German by just watching German TV. You have to be able to speak it, and you have to use it to learn it. And you already heard that it's quite complicated. But still, I think there's a good possibility to build this a match. The problem we at the moment have is that we don't even have enough German teachers to educate all those people who want to take the courses. So we have a lot of people who are waiting for months to get a German language course. And we have, if we have people with small children, for example, we have to have courses in which there is like some sort of childcare, so they can attend the courses and not take care of their children, which means that we have lots of male people working in language courses and taking language courses, and we have to build a special situation so that the wives, because they are mostly taking care of the children, can attend language courses as well and get to know the language as fast as possible. That is one thing I wanted to talk about. And then we were talking about refugee labor mobility, which I cannot talk about the situation within different African countries. I do not feel competent about that. But what I would still stress is, and I cannot stress that enough, because that has been a very good working situation in Germany, is working with the diaspora collectives. And it's because they can navigate. They already navigated through the system, and they're the first person often the newcomers go to get some advice. It's not the officials, but if they hear somebody talking in their own language, they ask the questions, and so they are very important. And we have lots of communities in Bremen which are built, like we have a Gambian community, we have a community from Eritrea, we have a Hindu community, we have an Indian community with people from India who are not like Hindu believers. We have and there are several of them, and they are already trying to cooperate together. There's doing some soccer tournaments to get people to know each other, and there's a very famous Pan-African Football Cup in Bremen every year. So it's all about getting into contact, and it's all about getting into contact with the community already being here, being it people who have arrived earlier or people who were grown up here. So for my importance, it's a lot about social skills and about building community. It's not only about legal pathways.
Thank you very much. Also, thank you for all these messages. I feel it all circles around the topic of collaboration, cooperation, mutual beneficial contact, and progression forward. We now have 15 minutes left, more or less. So I would say we take another round of questions. Maybe this time you could direct, again, as last panel, the question directly to somebody on the panel. And and I think we also can take 3 questions.
Good afternoon. My name is Shibuya, based here in Brussels at MPI. I'll start off my question by just setting a scene from a personal experience. So I'm Dutch, but also diaspora. I grew up in the Netherlands, but once in a while when I'm tired, I don't speak the language. And I found myself in a scenario where I was quite exhausted, but met somebody new and decided to speak English instead, because coming from a former colonized English country, English is my first language. I proceeded to have the conversation in English, and to the dissatisfaction of the person in front of me, they expressed their frustration about, migrants not speaking a language. I didn't immediately switch languages because being undercover actually led me to find out where this dissatisfaction was coming from. So I continued to ask further and was curious about, what kind of narratives or why they were so dissatisfied with migrants coming to the Netherlands. In this case, it was the perception that migrants were getting so many freebies. It seemed to him that, as soon as migrants arrived, they got everything they wanted. And it was actually quite easy to be a migrant. There was housing, there was social care. Housing specifically was, a big annoyance because it's such an issue in the home country itself. And this made me think of two of the topics that we discussed today. I was happy that Antje mentioned host community needs, which I think most of the time is not emphasized. From a migration perspective, we understand that a lot of these challenges are very practical, bureaucratic, the need for legal pathways, human rights concerns that could be easily addressed by policy solutions. But I think at the moment, what's winning is these narratives. And, one of the questions that came to mind is, is there a kind of ideological deficit from the left in countering a narrative? Even from this conversation with the stranger, it seemed so clear for him what the issue was and what the solution was. And I was almost overwhelmed and had to kind of switch on my either policy mind or, human perception. I thought, how am I going to actually encounter this conversation? I only spoke Dutch towards the end of the conversation, which really shocked him, and he realized we were the same. But what it did do is make me realize, how strong this far-right narrative is. And I'm wondering, on the one hand, what can we do in terms of, recommendation for host countries? Because oftentimes there are already existing issues in the place people are arriving. So for example, in the Netherlands, a context I know best, for many, many years, the government has cut back on a lot of the infrastructure that existed for migrants to integrate. So language is a common one that's thrown around and say, oh, but they don't speak the language, how can they even work? Well, it's very difficult to learn the language in the Netherlands when you have to take out a personal loan in order to learn the language. That's the current state of affairs. In the past, there were actually schools for people to go to, and learning a language is not an easy thing, as Patty has mentioned. Even when there is infrastructure, it still takes up a lot of people's livelihoods. From a personal perspective, it took me 2 years, even though I arrived as a young child. So what do we do in terms of recommendations for host countries that are very practical? How do we address those issues? And how do we also address this narrative that, the far right is kind of winning? I understand from a policy perspective, we give recommendations, very practically on what can actually be done. But at the same time, how do we find a balance between also, touching upon the elephant in the room, which is racism, migrants being treated unfairly because the color of their skin. if we're talking really concretely, these are challenges that are maybe not purely policy driven, but actually play into future thinking. One of the questions Patty asked, where are we going? What is our understanding of the future? Do we want a multicultural society? Because if we do, then we have solutions for that, and we understand that we're actually trying to grow a mixed society. So yeah, those are two of my questions, one around narratives and one concretely around what do we do for community needs in host countries.
Thank you. Yes, I think I have a short question. Interested in the regional perspective. So this would be Antje Grota, but also the trade union perspective would be interesting for me. That is, you mentioned a lot of the challenges, which are also mostly on the regional level, like language schools, etc., and need to be provided in the cities or in the regions where the person or the migrant is wanting to take up the work, etc. I was wondering, since we're in Brussels, do you have any requests from the EU institutions, or like, what do you need? Like, do you need legal framework? You were mentioning the single permit directive. What would you need precisely that you would think a migrant approach towards labor migration would be beneficial? You mentioned the talent pool with its ups and downs, but what else could there be that regional, the regions of Europe or cities where migration is actually taking place could be helpful for them from the EU level? Thank you.
Maybe I would first give the floor to you, Antje Grota, for answering the last question.
Yeah, okay, thank you so much, because that is, of course, like my elephant in the room always, because we're talking about a situation where we have the migrants arriving are not how to say that, spread evenly. You know, we have a directive where we decide that we want to have migrants all over Germany, but we have still different possibilities to tackle all the needs. If you go to a more rural area, it's even more complicated to find housing. If you are more to a city, you have more problems to find proper schools because the schools are already overcrowded. So what we're always talking about is being able to apply for the EU funds directly. You know, if we apply for EU funds, and we did that, and I think it was the first time it changed was with the AMEF fund, that the regions could be able to apply directly for funding, because most of it is about the money. So if you want to have proper housing, you have to maybe build a special building policy, which is not only for refugees or for migrants or newcomers, but it also has to involve people already living here. So there's no difference between them, because we need lots of apartments and accommodation for people with not the biggest amount of income. That is very important, and I think that is a problem all over Europe. We also would need money for addressing several problems in healthcare, because we need interpreters who could be able to translate what is going on. We would need more programs to build communities on very special situations. Just bring people in one neighborhood together. So there should be programs bringing people to the table to change the narrative. And this is on a very low level. It does not always take lots of money, but it's important that it's available for communities who want to engage in that. And the second part I wanted to mention is that if you talk to any corporation in Germany, they're always talking about their needs for employers, and they're always talking about the diversity they need within their labor workforce. So they have a very strong interest in working with people from many countries and making them work together as good as possible. And that is very important for us. The German Institute of Economy, which is a very, very civil, big economy, big business, scientific organization, says that Germany needs at least 400,000 people a year entering our labor market just to keep the standard, the economical standard we have at the moment. So they're very much in favor of people coming to us to enter the labor market. But still, since we do not want to brain drain, and we do not always get the people we need in special companies, we have to educate people ourselves, and we have to train people ourselves. So we have to make that possible as well. And what you need for that is, of course, always money. So that's a very important point for the region especially. I will leave it by that.
Thank you very much. Then I would propose we go in inverse order, and maybe you could keep your comments short on the narrative and infrastructure question that was raised.
I think I will try to answer this very important and complex comment that was made on racism, basically. I think it's, you know, I'll give my take. The racist, I think, is somebody who is obsessed with what is wrong with the other, with them. And but I do think that in Europe there is a growing awareness, of course not hegemonic, that the problem is with him or her, with racism, and not just for moral reasons. This can can apply for many of them, but but for structural reasons. I mean, I often use the metaphor of a self-immune disease. So Europe needs clearly something that we keep rejecting. So there is this, as in a self-immune disease, you need a substance, but your body, your organism does not, recognize that substance as necessary and rejects it. And this is, the tragedy, I think, of contemporary Europe. Of course, how to cope with this, how to heal this disease. I mean, if telling people, with a patronizing tone, as is often done, you are hurting yourself because you should be welcoming, you are a stupid Eastern German or South or Northern Italian, whatever, who is not able to see the broader picture, is counterproductive. We know that by now. So it's, of course, there should be rules, so which are often not respected. If you insult a group, you should have consequences, and this is a minimum, which doesn't often happen. But apart from that, I think the only or the most effective remedy is hearing people like you speaking in the public sphere. A lot, possibly a majority of my fellow nationals, think that a Black woman expressing articulate and sophisticated thoughts in the public sphere is a nonsense, is something that doesn't exist. And because, there is very, very little space in the public sphere in a country like Italy today for persons who do not embody the ideal of who is, thoughtful, articulate, and legitimate speaker in the public sphere. Of course, breaking these narrative cages, as we call it in a project we have ongoing on narratives about migration, is not enough, because it was not enough to have a Black president to reverse the tide. On the contrary, having a Black president activated deeper instincts and brought the struggle, because it's a struggle to a higher level, and we will see what happens in November. But I think there is no other way. There will be a struggle. There is a struggle. We cannot escape the struggle, I think. And so I think that being aware of this is very important. And of course, giving voice, as I think this group tried to do, to diverse brains is an important contribution.
Yeah, probably will be short. Yeah, on the narratives, I think I don't have a solution. I don't have I think it's important, this type of dialogues. I was thinking, it has been a while that we haven't discussed this type of issues, even if we are in the Brussels bubble, but still I think it's kind of relevant. I think at least on my role and within the trade unions, how to build that capacity through the projects. A little bit of what the colleague was mentioning, the funding is also very important. AMI, for example, the Asylum and Migration Integration Fund, we have been able to put in place lots of projects and programs for and I think from those, I always try to bring those, lessons learned and positive narratives and bringing that into the more, the policy making. I don't know, after almost 15 years working on migration issues, I feel that it's quite frustrating from the personal, also professionally point of view. I think there's always waves, and I think, I always try to remain, positive, that there's still, we are people like the ones here, that, I think that we can still bring some kind of that, change and that positive narrative. But I think, yes, I was thinking the role of the media. There is some colleagues here. I think also how, it's not only among us, but also how you, for the public perceptions, how to, kind of build those walls. I don't know. I always try to be positive, but now it's true that I'm becoming a little bit of a no. I think I don't. Again, I don't have the solution. I think it's still important that we keep that. These groups. Also, Ferruccio was mentioning our dialogue, but also involve countries of origin. And also, I think it's very important, at least on my role and at European level, this type of projects that bring that kind of on the ground experience, and always, at least for myself, how I really try to pull that into the policy making, and try to make a change here where decisions are being taken.
I was just thinking that everyone is very concerned about narratives, including member states, so they've taken the conversation high up. If you look up something called the Global Forum on Migration and Development, they've been prioritizing actually a working group. So that brings all of our member states to talk about narratives. But like Melissa, very little change you see on the ground. So clearly, I think, Chibuye, the conversation has to come down to the community. And saying that, I think shifting this narrative, from, migrants, the narrative is migrants take. We're saying people give. Migrants give, is a really difficult one that involves a couple of things, and I'll just give it as points. Media influence is really important, and social media, by the way, is also very important. So migrant stories, what migrants talk about themselves, how they've depicted their food. If you don't know about jollof wars, I don't know where you live, because now we know more and more about African food and culture. If you don't know about Afrobeats, then I also don't know where you live. And if you don't know about Korean pop culture, I also don't know where you live. So there's so many of these things that social media has had an influence by people living them and navigating them in many forums. So I think it's about also opening our eyes. But I was also thinking about joint celebration. This weekend, maybe that's why my voice is cracky, I spent a whole day at the Kenyan Women in Germany culture event that just didn't talk about Kenyan culture. So we looked beautiful and colorful. Children from African communities, women, men, but also had consular put a stand out there and talk about Kenyans getting back their citizenship that had lost their citizenship because, complicated thing between Germany and Kenya, that if you took one, you lost the other. So all that kind of conversation in there, with food and everything. I was mostly by the food stand, but, I think speaks a lot to, to the examples that Bremen has also shared around, sharing of culture, but those events that really take us beyond talking about community, but actually living community and what that looks like. And I think the role of the diaspora has, cannot be overemphasized, and the diversity of it. But I was also going to say two other points in that. One is flexibility in the measures. recorded double standards when we saw how Ukraine doors opened for Ukrainians and shut immediately for the same third country nationals that were coming from the same war. But clearly they were walking down together. And so I think Europe has it in it. There's a willingness somewhere. So we know it's happened before. And how do we tap into it? And I think for me, it's community, because even in countries like Hungary that we thought doors may not be open for migrants, actually people opened their doors for all kinds of migrants that were fleeing the war from Ukraine. But the policy shut people out. But the policy shut human beings out, but the people opened their doors. So there is a potential that we could still tap in there. So I think flexibility, that also comes from employers, by the way, that managed to waive a lot of these things that we saw, I think, with Ukraine. Something my son said to me when I tried to describe him to a friend, I said, he is 50% Zambian and 50% Danish. He said, Mama, I am 100% Zambian and 100% Danish. And so celebrating and understanding who you are. But, I've come from a culture where you are 50-50. I'm also half from western part of Zambia and half from southern. But now I've changed, and I told my mom, I'm 100% and 100%, and a bit more learning. So I think bicultural celebration is really very important in how we open the space. And I think the city of Brussels has actually been very instrumental in that through the leadership. So that's another one. How do we also support diaspora leadership, right? And that is very important in terms of how we demonstrate. And I also thought to say, starting at the school level, how much cultural awareness do we have in the education system to understand that there's a diversity of students in public schools? I'm not talking about international schools, public schools in Europe that sometimes don't understand that you have to be culturally aware, that the lunchbox may not just have dark bread if you're in Denmark. So rye bread is not the solution, but chapati also exists. And it may look a bit oily and unhealthy, but we've been eating it all our lives and nothing has happened to us. So I think that kind of cultural awareness is also very important in transcending what's the message that we have. But I thought two things. The legal pathways is also showing us that there are closed doors. I've talked a lot about Denmark because that's the home country of my husband and my two children. And I still carry a Schengen visa to enter the space. Kids are 10 and 8, by the way. So it's a long time going. But Switzerland has the same examples. United Kingdom and many others have these closed doors to these legal pathways. And I think that's one of the questions that have been asked around the legal pathways that seem to be there. These long-term permits, the single directive permit also has a lot of sort of restrictions. This is not the type of labor that at least is being spoken about in Bremen as well. And at the same time, we know that there's information complexity. A network called the Network of, which I'm a part of, Network of African Diaspora, that was supporting third country nationals, and I'm ending in a second, talked about one country, this is Germany, 16 ways to integrate because you've got rules that come down at the lower level, interpreted very differently, which migrants may not understand. They're not coming to Bremen, they're coming to Germany. And then when they arrive, they're actually in Berlin, and it's a totally different ballgame. And I end there.
Great. Thank you very much. We are a bit over time, but I would still love to hand the phone to Anna Teron-Kuzi for the closing remarks. And then the lunch, I think, is already prepared. So yeah, some more minutes, and then we're free to go.
Thank you very much. Oh, thank you so much. I have some notes here. Perfect. Thank you very much. What we are closing now, it's not only the session, but work done during some month by a group of experts together with or gathered by FEPS and the Migration Working Group and the program. So first of all, I have to thank you very much, FEPS. I have to thank you very much, the EVA Foundation, for the support. And I have to thank you all the team of FEPS that made this possible. Julia, who's sitting here, and Hedy, who's not here today, but we wish her, all of us, a very quick recovery. And I'm sure that she really wanted to be here, and I saw that she's listening to us. So a big applause. And a big hug, and thank you very much, Heidi. I'm not going to explain to you what we were doing all those months. You can read that. There are a number of papers produced by the working group, and they are very interesting. And I'm not going to explain you again what you have already heard today and what we did tomorrow. But I want to underline a couple of things on the work done. First of all, that's been a group in which there's been a dialogue between the European Union and Africa. And I think that that have to continue. It's been very interesting, even for me. I think that one of the problems we have now in Europe is that we are closed in our own issues. We see others related with migration as third countries, when we have to start thinking that we are a transnational land with transnational relations, and that we have to look at others also as part of us, and we have to continue this conversation instead of trying to imposing this migration diplomacy, which is more and more isolating things and breaking things in silos and preventing a broader conversation. So I really hope that we have room to continue that, and that we could bring this message of having this open conversation to our institutions, stakeholders, and leaders from the local level to the EU, and work together with you, with people from Africa. Migration is more than migrants, is related with all aspects of life and economy here and in the world. I mean, when we say migrations, we are talking about more than migrants, and we say migrant, we are reducing people with many, many other dimensions to the dimension of a migrant. Migrants are workers, have family, are mothers, are fathers, are children. They are nationals, non-national, 100% from their part of the world, even if they have scarcely lived there because they arrived young when they were young. They are Europeans, they are many things. Migration, to get back to that, is a system. It's a system which is part of the economic, political, and social global system. And unless we understand what's the position of migration towards the global system and all the components of this global system, we will be forced, and when I say we at this very moment, I'm not saying this family, but the European Union will be forced to just try to control flows. Because if we do not understand the big picture, that's the only small thing in which, as it happened the last 25 years in Europe, in which we will get consensus, or at least part of us will get consensus while the rest of us keep arguing and discussing. So let's try to understand this, and I want to mention one of the panelists, Ottilia, or we will be condemned to over control, which will mean getting things out of control. Thank you.